It's James Stevenson. I'm with the CJR standing panel on impact assessment. And I'm just going to take a few minutes to set the stage here for today. We have a very exciting and full program.
Hold off for a few seconds because people are still logging on. And so
okay.
Until it stops moving, so everybody's on the same page.
Yeah. Oh gosh, yeah, we're really getting a lot. till the numbers stabilize. And Erin, you're recording?
Yes, I am.
Great.
Am I in?
Hi, David.
Hey, James. How are you? Good. Hey, Karen.
Okay.
Thanks for doing this, David. We were very excited about it.
Yeah.
It'll be an interesting day.
Okay, it looks like we're kind of stabilized on the numbers. Should I get started? Okay. Thanks very much, everybody, for joining us. We're really excited about the program we have today. Topic being remote sensing for impact evaluation, and with a specific focus on the environmental externalities from agricultural intensification. So my name is James Stevenson. I'm with the CJR Standing Panel on Impact Assessment. I will introduce the other panelists for today in just a second, but just to set the scene, for those of you who are listening in and joining us, who haven't been part of the process to now, this is the second workshop in a process of building the momentum behind a set of studies that we have been working on with the collaboration, SPIA working with the Environmental Market Solutions Lab, emLab at UC Santa Barbara. And so we initially had a call for expressions of interest last year that was put out for, we went through a consultation process, developed full proposals, and we've now converged on a set of studies. And so really the needs of those studies, which are going to be addressing interesting environmental externalities linked to agricultural intensification in different ways. That's really at the heart of this workshop. And so you see them listed here, and members of these studies are all represented in this workshop as panelists. And we've also, as you can see from the program, invited some really exciting external speakers to talk to us about particular topics in addition. So the four projects listed here, there's a study on IBLI led by Cornell, the index-based livestock insurance. We have a study on the Happy Seeders technology in India, led by CIMMIT, a study on land use, land cover change from a upscaling project in Mali being led by IAMO in Germany, and a study on Demilune adoption in Niger being led by Tufts. So that's set the stage, and these four projects are, as I say, being in the early stages. And we've convened this workshop because a common feature of all of them is that they use remote sensing to some greater or lesser extent, essential to their research strategy. I will now take the opportunity to introduce our panel, and I would love to be able to see our panel here. But let me start by introducing Karen, and we'll work our way from there. And I'll come back to some logistics once I have introduced the panel. Karen, over to you.
Sure. My name is Karen Macour. I'm professor at Paris School of Economics, researcher at INRAE, and here as chair of SPIA. Very welcome, everybody. Very excited about this workshop.
Thanks, Karen. David, can you introduce yourself, please?
Oh, I thought you were introducing us. I'll introduce
I will do that gracefully. I'm sorry. I'll work my way
No,
down.
I just had to find the mute button. I'm David Lobell. I am a professor at Stanford University, and you'll be hearing from me, and I guess shortly. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much, David. Binayak.
Yes, this is Binayak Mohanty. I'm a professor at Texas A&M College Station. I mostly work in hydrology, soil moisture, soil hydraulics, including remote sensing as well as on the ground sensors. Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us, Binayak. Erin, introduce yourself. You're next on my listing.
Hi, everyone. My name is Erin O'Reilly. I'm the Projects and Operations Coordinator for the Environmental Market Solutions Lab at UCSB and helped organize this workshop.
And been essential to it. Thanks so much, Erin. Patrick.
Yes, me. So I'm Patrick Meffra. I'm from the University of Louvain in Belgium. And so I'm contributing to the project on sorghum and millet intensification in Mali, which is led by Delini Abegouna-Wardan, which is there also.
Yes, thanks so much, Patrick. Let me pass to Delini to introduce herself as well. Thank you.
Oh.
So hi everyone, I'm Delini. Delini Abegouna-Wardan. I'm now based at YAMO in Germany, and so I'm also with this land use land cover change project in Mali. Yes.
Thanks, Delini. Next in order on my screen, Kelsey, who has been co-organizing this with SPIA. And Kelsey, would you like to introduce yourself and say a few words?
Thanks, James. I'm Kelsey Jack. I'm on the faculty at UC Santa Barbara and have been leading the kind of organization of this call for proposals on behalf of emLab and am also a PI on one of the projects. Thanks.
Thanks, Kelsey. Jennifer Alix-Garcia.
Hi. My name is Jen Alix-Garcia. I'm a professor at Oregon State University in the Department of Applied Economics, and I'll be talking to you in a little bit. I'm looking forward to it. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Jen. Meha, thanks for joining us. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks. I'm Meha Jain. I'm an assistant professor in the School for Environment and Sustainability at the University of Michigan, and I'll be presenting on mapping smallholder agriculture, and I'm also collaborating with Vijesh Krishna and Simit on this second project listed here.
Great, thanks, and outstanding Zoom background there, Meha. Kunwar.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kunwar Singh, and I'm geospatial scientist at AData, the College of William and Mary, and also associated faculty in the Center for Geospatial Analysis.
Great, thanks, Kunwar. Kathy.
Hi, I'm Kathy Baylis. I'm a professor in geography at UC Santa Barbara, and I'll be talking to you later, saying things that'll probably be obvious by the end of the day, but I figure that's my role.
Thanks so much, Kathy. Ying, can we see you? Is your camera working? Yeah, there. Great, thanks.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Sorry, I cannot see myself somehow.
Hello,
everyone. This is Ying Sun. I'm assistant professor at Cornell, working closely with Chris Barrett. So my research focuses on satellite remote sensing for vegetation and also ecosystem modeling. So I will be talking in a bit on remote sensing assessment for land degradation. Thank you.
Thanks, Ying. Chris Barrett.
Hi, everyone. Hi, folks. I'm Chris Barrett. I'm a professor at Cornell University, an economist, working with Ying and colleagues at both ILRI and USGA on the project, trying to assess the environmental impacts, specifically the rangeland health impacts of index-based livestock insurance in Ethiopia and Kenya. Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks, everyone. That constitutes our panel. As I say, this is a really exciting mix of people directly involved in these projects and those we've explicitly invited to contribute and share their perspectives on specific topics. And shortly, I will introduce our first speaker, David Lobell, who will give us a keynote address. This is a fantastic opportunity to have this group of people together, and we've sort of gone for a kind of hybrid where, as well as having the needs of these 4 studies in mind throughout the course of today, we're keen to share the discussion with a wider group. And so currently we have close to 90 people joining us, listening in, and that's absolutely fantastic. And so in order to manage that, just some kind of ground rules in terms of how we plan to run today. As you'll see on the agenda, there are various points for Q&A after presentations. We encourage you to use the Q&A function in Zoom for raising questions, and we'll go through and have time at the end of each presentation for addressing those. You'll see that later in the morning there are 2 breakout sessions where we will join different Zoom calls. There are separate Zoom links in the agenda for each of those, and that is a more free-form discussion on the specific topics that have been raised in the presentation. And so that will be a more open discussion than is really possible with such a large group in plenary. Okay, without further ado, I'd like to introduce David. So let me stop sharing my screen. David Lobell, professor at Stanford University. David has been a tremendous source of advice to SPIA through the years. I'm sure he's known to all of you for his work in remote sensing. We're very, very excited that he is here to present a keynote for us on remote sensing, the state of science and future applications. So without further ado, let's start and hear from David. 30 minutes, and we'll have Q&A at the end being led by Kelsey. Thanks, David.
Okay. After 8 months, it's still, when I present, it's hard for me to find the mute button. There we go. Thanks, James. So I'm very excited about today, and I appreciate the chance to participate. I've as much as I've had an interest in remote sensing and in environmental externalities, I've never actually figured out, I guess, how to really apply remote sensing to look exactly at environmental externalities. So it'll be an interesting discussion. My comments are going to be, I think, well, let's see if they're going to be things that I think are probably obvious, but never were obvious to me until recently. So maybe they'll be helpful for others, and maybe not. Okay, let me just start by stating the obvious, which is that this is a great time to be doing remote sensing. This is a nice figure that my colleague Marshall Burke made recently that I'm trying out here, which is a summary of the different imagery that's been available throughout history. The main sort of public and some private data sets that we use in research that have been available. And the black points are showing you what was available in 2010, and the y-axis is the spatial resolution, and the x-axis is the revisit rate, basically the cloud-free revisit rate. And when we're talking about smallholder agriculture in particular, you know, we're typically interested in something that's on the order of 10 meters or finer resolution. And you can see that up until 2010, really all we had was, you know, occasionally observations that were, say, on the order of once a year or a couple times a year. These were also, in some cases, quite expensive. And then we had Landsat down here in 30 meters, at 30 meters. But now we have this frontier kind of expanding very rapidly till both with Planet and the Sentinel constellation, to where we can do really monitoring of smallholder agriculture in a way that we never have done before. And so there's been a lot of progress in using this, and I just expect it to really continue, if not accelerate, over the coming decade. So I've just listed here a bunch of different outcomes that, you know, I've seen at least recently and throughout the last decade, at least, progress being made in the remote sensing world. And In some cases, progress has been to the point where it's almost like a solved problem, like we have very high accuracies. I'll show an example of that in a second. In other cases, this is just promising results that suggest that we can do something that's potentially useful right now, and it'll keep getting better. In the case of environmental externalities, I guess, you know, we can have a discussion about which particular ones, but the ones that I think have been the most focused on from the remote sensing community are things related to land cover and tree cover in particular. But at the same time, we're also getting better at measuring other types of outcomes related to, say, overall poverty levels, infrastructure, and these are all, I think, of relevance when we're trying to, say, evaluate the impact of large-scale interventions from the CG system or elsewhere. A couple of examples. I'm not going to take the whole time to go through example by example, but I'll give you a couple that I think just very recent examples that I think are exciting or good demonstrations of what's going on. One is looking at cropping intensity, and this is, this audience knows well, this means the number of crops that you grow in a year. And you can see this typical pattern in fields that have multiple crops per year, where you've got, this is an extreme example, but where you've got the greenness of the field peaking, being harvested, and then coming up again. And you can count the number of cycles per year. And you can do this now. We have, again, the density in terms of time frequency of high resolution data to do this really at the individual field level. And this shows you a recent paper by Liu looking at region by region, the frequency of different types of cropping intensity, and then mapping it out at the individual pixel level. And you can see wide variation. None of these patterns overall are surprising, but when you go in and zoom in, you can often see a lot of variation. And for example, as, say, investments in irrigation go in, it's always of interest to know whether farmers are increasing their cropping intensity. I think the economists in the room can tell you that, that's one of the main indicators that labor productivity is going up. Another example, which I think is exciting, and it's it's something that I think was expected as both the imagery got better and as the machine learning techniques continue to improve and borrow from what's been done in other areas of computer vision. There's a recent paper by Waldner and Diakogiannis looking at mapping field boundaries and coming up with a generic enough model that it's working in a wide range of systems. So this just shows you the raw data on the top, and down here is showing you what the algorithm produces in terms of individual fields. And then they look at things like field size. Looking at field parcels is something that is useful for maybe not necessarily looking at the environmental externalities, but there's a lot of interesting applications, including just using those parcels as a way of improving algorithms for other things like crop classification. This has not really yet been ported to smallholder systems. As you know, there's if you look at most of these countries, these are not smallholder systems, but I expect the technology will be getting there very soon, and it's something that various people are working on. Yes, this just shows you a map of, again, how it's a very high resolution. You can map these field parcels. Okay, so then if you sort of take that as given, that things are getting better, then the question is, how do we start to use these measures for impact evaluation? And that's what I'll have my comments on. I should have put a timer on, but James, you can flag me if I'm going long. I don't think I will, but give me like a 5-minute. I have you on my screen here. Okay, so here I have, I say 4 points here, I guess. Yeah, it'll be maybe 3.5. I'll try to stretch it to 4, but these are I think the main lessons that I've learned, and these again are going to seem not to be very complex statements, but I think I didn't quite appreciate how each of these were true. And the first is just that the stuff that we're typically using to do impact evaluation is often quite bad. And in the world of looking at crop practices, in the world of looking at all sorts of measures of agricultural performance, I think this understanding has really been pushed forward in recent years especially by the work of the World Bank Group and doing very careful analyses of multiple types of measuring ways of measuring things, whether it's labor inputs or area inputs, land inputs, or outputs, it's often the case that we find different measures give very different answers. And we've worked with the World Bank team in a few cases. One was look in Uganda, where we compared different yield measures. And this shows you two of the main ways that we measure yields typically is one by doing an interview with a farmer, asking them for self-reported production and area. The other is going out with enumerators and marking off, as hopefully you can see here, marking off sections to do crop cuts and trying to sample some fraction of the field and actually measure the output. This is, again, like I would say, when you're looking at evaluating impacts of interventions, almost always yield is being measured, and almost always it's being measured in one of these two ways. If you look at, though, the correlation, say, between these two at the field level, you can see a couple of things. One is that on average, so self-reports in particular have become clearly, it's become clear that they're often quite biased. And this is largely driven by very high estimates on sometimes on small fields. So you have that kind of bias. And then you also have just very low agreement at the field level between self-report and crop cut. And this has been something I think that, again, it's not surprising that they don't agree exactly. And I think it's just to understand sort of the depth of the uncertainty in some of these ground measures. So I think the main point here is largely that we don't want to set the bar too high for remote sensing, in a sense. Like we we often privilege ground measures because they are sort of what we're used to, but we have to, I think, remind ourselves sometimes that, the standard for which we need to put things is not necessarily that the errors are zero. And this is just another measure. What we've done recently is I've gone in, and thanks to like the Tamasa efforts and a few others, there's been a lot of crop cut data collected in the last 5 or 6 years, and both throughout Africa and elsewhere. And what I've done is gone in and looked at those data sets and just looked at the correlation between 2 different crop cut measures. So now this is actually the same method, but because these studies have taken more than one crop cut per field, you can just look across all the fields in the sample or in whatever region they're working. What is the correlation between the crop cut, the first crop cut from each field and the second crop cut from each field? And in some cases, like with irrigated, I think this is Meha's study up here, with irrigated wheat, you don't have that much heterogeneity in the field. And typically, if you take a single crop cut or a couple of crop cuts, you get a pretty good estimate of the overall yield. But that's really the exception rather than the rule. Even in some irrigated rice systems, you see much lower correlations, indicating much more heterogeneity in the field. And particularly in rain-fed maize. So this is most of this is the Tamasa results that were in Tanzania, Nigeria, Ethiopia. You again typically see correlations around 0.6, 0.7 maybe. So less than half of the variation in one crop cut measure is actually captured by another crop cut measure from that same exact field. So even though we tend to think of, and some of these are 4x4, 5x5 crop cuts, even though we tend to think of these as kind of the gold standard, we have to again just I think appreciate how bad that data is. Now, a lot of people look at that and I think I was guilty of this in some ways as well, as we look at the ground data as being so noisy, and then we sort of don't know even how to convince anyone that the satellite data is good because we have nothing good to compare it to. And I think there's also sort of a notion out there that, garbage in, garbage out. If you're training on noisy data, there's really nothing you can hope for that the remote sensing trained on these models can do. You need to find other ways to collect data to be higher quality to really be able to train these models. And I think that one of the biggest lessons is that that's not the case. That over and over again in the machine learning world, we see that noise in training data is not. I'm not going to say it's not relevant. It is relevant, but it is not determinative of the results of the satellite models. So I'll go back to that Uganda example. What we found is that even though those crop cut measures were very noisy, in the sense that there was a lot of variation depending, on the particular crop cut. If we take, say, those crop cuts and we calibrate a model using satellite data, so this is on the x-axis here. If we look at trying to predict that crop cut yield with the satellite data, we can calibrate it. We get a calibration R-squared of about a quarter of the variance in the crop cut yields can be explained by the satellites. Now what we do is we take that remote sensing model, and luckily in this particular study, we had a subset of the farmers where we actually harvested the entire field. So this is a rare case where we actually have the true yield. And when we look at our comparisons of the model that has been trained on this crop cut data against the full plot yield, we actually see much higher R-squareds. So the point here is that, you know, a lot of this error is random, and a lot of that random error doesn't actually affect your calibration. This is random error on the left-hand side of the regression. If for those who are thinking about this in terms of regressions, that's going to not really affect the parameters of your say in this case a simple linear model, and therefore you still get you can get quite reliable estimates. It's hard to know that they're reliable without actually collecting in this case full plot yields. Another recent example of this from a PhD student, Sherry Wong of mine, is looking at noisy labels on the crop type side. And this could be, you could think of this more generally as land cover side if we're thinking about looking at land cover changes. What she did was work with Plantix, which some of you may know is a startup that is collecting, well, they're servicing farmers by providing diagnostics based on pictures of what might be wrong with their crop. But as part of that process, they also have an algorithm that tries to predict what crop they're looking at in the picture. That's kind of the first step in trying to diagnose. And often the farmers will put in the label, but they often have to predict it. So they have, for each image that's been taken, they have both a picture with a predicted crop type, and they have a location. And that location is not perfect. It's quite noisy in some cases. And so what we've done is, first off, we've looked at like cleaning the data, for example, by using high-res imagery to determine whether that point is actually taken within a field or not. Sometimes people will take the picture at their house, or they'll be in a city in like their little backyard in a vegetable garden, but we're trying to filter to things that are actually in fields. And then we use that data, which has only been slightly cleaned. There's still a lot of uncertainty in the label of what the crop is. There's a lot of uncertainty in the exact geolocation of it. We use that to combine that with time series of Sentinel-2 and Sentinel-1 data to try to then build a model to predict the crop type. And that's what this shows down here is a resulting crop type map for 2 states in Southeast India, Telangana and AP. This map is a 3 crop classification. We found that we only really had enough samples to do cotton and rice well in this case, and then we have other, which is in the gray here. But this is sort of a summary that I'm not gonna, is a bit of a busy plot, but let me just walk you through it quickly. What this shows is on the right-hand side is the data we use to train the model, and looking at a validation set drawn from that data. So I shouldn't say, it's a subset of the data used to train the model that we set aside for validation, but the same sort of distribution of the data. And we can see the accuracies estimated from this are on the order of, say, 67, 68%. And that's showing you here, if we also say run different filters for, say, that you can't use any points that have less than 20 meter accuracy, or any points that have less than 10 meter accuracy, or you let any points that have 50 meter accuracy here. And this also shows if you if you look at excuse me, the different ways of labeling the crop. Some of them were actually hand labeled, some of them were labeled by a model. And then, as I showed before, different ways of cleaning up in terms of whether it's actually in a field or not. So the point here is that if we look overall at these test statistics, what you see is that they're on the order of between 65 and 70%. But if we then do a clean validation set, and so just to be clear here, all of these are different ways of training the model here, but they're all tested on sort of the bulk of the data. And here, this is still the different ways of training the model, but now they're tested on the clean data set, meaning the ones that we have good geolocation accuracy, good labeling for, and we know that it's in the field. And all of a sudden you see that same model that's trained on that noise data looks a lot better. And this is not, again, something that isn't, I guess, obvious in hindsight, but it is really important because a lot of times people will be reporting their training accuracy and thinking that that's sort of an upper limit on the skill of a model, because we're trained to think that, you can never do better than your training, especially if you have, small sample relative to your number of parameters. But in machine learning, even with all of the complexities of these models, the way they're trained tends to really avoid overfitting to this noise if you do it properly. And in that case, typically what we find is that training accuracy is sort of a lower limit in some cases on what your actual accuracy is, because again, there's a lot of noise, and we know there's a lot of noise in that training data. And then maybe a point that's not worth spending time on is that we were interested in this trade-off between number of data points and the quality of the data points. And there is a trade-off, and you could make yourself actually worse by adding noisy data in, but that's more the exception rather than the rule. Okay, so this is now a related point, but given that we know that noisy data can still be useful, we have to be careful about how we evaluate performance. We don't want to sort of have remote sensing estimates considered only in the context of noisy data. And I'll go back to this example where if we have a crop cut measure and we're trying to evaluate the yield performance, the correlation, say, or the RMSE between our crop cut measure and our satellite measure is not going to be a reliable indicator of performance. But as we think about measurement error, and I think this is going to be a theme for today, we can often think about ways to actually get a more accurate measure of performance, even if we don't have gold standard field measures, even if we just have a good quantitative sense of how noisy or how much error is likely to be in our data. And I'll show a couple of examples here. So with the crop cut measures, one thing we've done is sort of work through the math of the different measurement errors, and we've done some simulations showing you that if we simulate a bunch of field data according to the characteristics, say, of all of the crop cut data that I showed you from various studies, we can simulate what kind of the typical correlation would be between a satellite model and a model trained on that crop cut. Sorry, the satellite model trained on that crop cut data and the crop cut data itself. And then we can actually adjust if we have a good estimate of the noise in the crop cut measures. So this would be, in this case, measured as the correlation between two different measures. So two independent ground measures. This could be two crop cut measures. It could be a self-report measure and a crop cut measure. But if we have a good sense of what that error is, the math actually works out that it's really just the geometric mean of the performance of the satellite estimate against each of these individual ground measures divided by the correlation of the ground measures. And you can see, at least in the simulation world, that this adjustment on average works quite well in terms of giving us a good estimate of the R squared, even though we've been training on noisy data. Another thing that we've often seen in terms of being careful about evaluating measures is that we often, especially for impact evaluation, want to understand how things are changing over time. And I'm going to switch here to an example of wealth predictions. So this is work that Marshall Burke and Stefano Ermon and I have been working on for the last few years, trying to look at using things like daytime imagery, nighttime imagery, and other inputs to predict wealth at a fine resolution. And this shows you just a recent paper that did this for a bunch of countries. And then this on top shows you its comparison to sort of out of sample measures from at the village level and at the district level throughout the continent. Now, what we often sort of wonder is, this is in the cross section. This is sort of looking across a large area. How well can we capture variation spatially? But what often is of interest is whether a place is getting wealthier or not. And what we find is that it's very difficult. What we can do is sort of try to piece together from, say, these surveys that have been done that are often cross-sectional DHS surveys within a country. We can try to piece together a time change, but it's actually quite difficult. If we limit ourselves to the ones like, and this is from LSMS surveys, if we limit ourselves to the areas that have had actually repeated measures over time, and we compare that to our model predicted changes over time, here's what you get in terms of predicting now, not just the spatial variation, but predicting the temporal change over time. And you can see at the cluster level, we're down now from what we had before down to a much smaller R squared. And at the district level, we do a bit better. But the challenging thing here is that what we're looking at now as a ground measure is an LSMS change of change over time, where these LSMS surveys are not very stable at the individual observation level. And so we've done a bunch of simulations and others trying to look at what is the influence of noise on this estimate of change over time. So this is not really a case where, as before, we feel like we have a good, I would say, solution in terms of actually estimating accurately how well we're doing. It's just, again, to point out that when you're evaluating, you always have to think about what is the noise. And in this case, it's not clear that, how much noise is actually in those ground measures of delta hills over time, because there's just very little data on that. So because of this, and in other settings as well, where we have different challenges of actually directly comparing the outcome that we measure to an outcome, whether it's a change or not, we've also often, in this theme of being careful about how you evaluate your model, we've often found it useful to pull in another variable, a third variable. And this is just an example of this wealth data here, looking at how it, if you build up a regression or a spline regression here, sorry, my Zoom window's in the way. Looking at, say, the relationship between wealth and temperature. So now what we're doing is we're going to take the survey data and build up that relation. That's shown in the gray line here. And now with our remote sensing estimates, instead of trying to directly compare them to the survey data, what we're going to do is compare them to this third variable and look at what that response function looks like, and then evaluate the performance of the model based on its agreement with this third variable. And you can think of this third variable as, in a sense, providing something that has noise as well, but the noise is independent of both the survey data and the model prediction. Similarly, in the world of going back to that Uganda example with crop yields, what we found is that even when we were calibrating on those noisy, I'm calling them noisy, they're as good as you can do, but they're still a very, because of the heterogeneity of these fields, I'll call them noisy crop cut measures. What we found is the model, you could pull in a third variable, like whether or not the farmer used fertilizer, or whether or not the soil quality was rated at a certain level. And you can look at the correlations of our estimates with those, and our estimates would be this blue model trained on those noisy. You can look at the correlation of the estimates from remote sensing with these inputs and compare that correlation to the one you get when you substitute in the actual data. In this case, the crop cut yields would normally be done in sort of a study of factor productivity. And what you find in this case is, again, that even though the agreement between the satellite and the crop cut yields, when you directly compare them, may not at first glance look that good, when you bring in a third variable that has independent errors, and you have to think hard about whether those errors truly are independent of both of these measures, then you see that these measures are pretty comparable. And so that sort of gives you confidence that at least a big part of that agreement or lack of agreement was due to the noise. All right, so let me wrap up here. And do I have like 2 minutes? I'm not sure exactly where I'm at. Okay, so, and this is, again, an obvious point, and one that I think other speakers will hopefully build on, is that as we think about impact evaluation, there's lots of ways to do it. And the identification strategy, different identification strategies will rely on different sort of aspects of the data, different sort of sources of variation. And I think the sort of exciting area or like just a very interesting area right now is to think about matching the types of identification strategy used to the strengths of the data that you have. In particular, here's just a list of things that I'm sure many of you know a lot better than I do, but these are the types of strategies we typically look to do rigorous impact evaluation. And they use different sort of sources of variation. I would say that in general, when we're talking about satellite data, we have some real strengths that we have to, I think, play to with the identification strategies if we're going to be successful. One is obviously the very large sample sizes. I think generally speaking, satellite data are really good at getting fine scale variations across space. That you can think of this as the measurement errors are highly correlated in space. So if you're looking at differences between nearby estimates, they tend to be those errors. A lot of that error tends to cancel out. And they're also, I think, have proven quite useful in understanding trends, gradual trends over time. But at the same time, we do see that they often have problems getting accuracies for individual fields, and in particular for detecting, say, change from one year to the next. That year on year changes, like a single year change, you could miss a factor easily in remote sensing that's happening on the ground. And I give the example here, fall armyworm in recent years in terms of yield estimation. Getting that 1 year on year off change can be difficult. And so I had a couple examples, but let me stop here. Maybe I'll use this example from Meha's work, because this is my claim. One of my claims to fame is having mentored Meha for a short period of time. And this is I think still to me one of the most striking examples of how good satellites are at picking up discontinuities that can be very useful for the understanding what's going on in the world. This is the border between Haryana and UP in India, and this shows you estimates of wheat yields averaged over many years, but you can just see the clear breaks that happen over time. And I think repeatedly we see in different studies that trying to exploit those kind of spatial discontinuities can get you quite far, and in ways that are often not even possible with some of the ground measures we have, because we don't have that kind of detailed spatial coverage. So I'm gonna skip my other example and just end there.
Excellent. Thanks so much, David. So we have about 10 minutes for Q&A. The way that I suggest we try to do this is I'm going to toggle back and forth between the great questions that were asked in the Q&A panel and live questions from attendees. So if you have a question that you did not type into the Q&A window, please put up your hand, and I'll be going back and forth between calling on you and calling on those who have already typed in their questions. So I'd like to start with one of the questions that was typed in, and if you don't mind, I'll ask you to unmute yourself and just ask it yourself in your own words. So Jen Alix-Garcia, could I start with your question?
Sure. I don't think my question is the best question, but I was just wondering if you could speak to the progress that's been made in developing layers that allow us to differentiate between different types of crops or different types of forest, and how you see the progress there.
So Kelsey, did you want me to answer one by one? Sorry if
I think go ahead. That sounds great.
Okay. So my knowledge of forests is far worse than yours, Jen. So I'm gonna just say that there's been, I think on the I would say let's call it the high res world. There's been a lot of excitement around using much higher resolution data to count individual trees. There was, I think, a paper a few weeks ago that got a lot of attention along those lines of mapping every tree in the West Africa or the Sahel or something. And then there's also one kind of exciting area that I've seen and started to dabble in is the spaceborne LiDAR data, which can really characterize like the vertical characteristics of trees and really help to, I think, diagnose the type of, even if within a type of forest, like diagnose the characteristics of that forest. So that's just to say that there is, I'm sure, progress being made in terms of type of forest. I'm much more familiar with the type of crop world, and I think that it's proven to be a very hard problem, which is, I think, makes it interesting to work on. But I do see the combination of the types of stuff I showed with like Plantix and just getting more creative about collecting training data, the 50 by 30 efforts that the World Bank is leading to collect a lot more really well georeferenced crop type data, and the parcel delineation work that I showed that's going to really, I think, help provide a constraint on some of these crop classification approaches, both because you can, I think, assume that pixels within the same field are likely to be the same crop, but also because the parcel size may give you some indicator of what the crop is likely to be. and maybe even some of this LiDAR data, this is something we're testing now, looking at whether it's useful for crop type. So we've seen that the radar data, for example, helps a little bit, but not as much as we might have hoped. So I don't know if that answers your question, but there's clearly progress. We're not at the point yet where we'd like to be in terms of saying that here's like the kind of thing we have in the US where you can go in and every year see a cropland data layer where you've got, 25 or 30 different types of crops that have been mapped out at the pixel level. We're not there in any other country, in any of these developing countries that we tend to work. But I don't think we're that far off. I think that in 5 years that'll be a common thing.
Thank you.
Great. Giriraj from IMI, if you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
I can also see it. I don't know if the participants can unmute, but this is about the scaling opportunities. And
exactly. Yeah, okay. I can read it out so that everyone else can hear it. So what are the scaling opportunities on these approaches given the limitation of field data access and its quality? I believe the methods are independent of scales, for example, plots district, and the need to propose optimization methods. So I think this relates to what you were starting to describe.
I'm unmuted now, but thank you, Jack, for reading out the question.
Yeah, I think that the I'm not sure I totally understand that in terms of you're interested in the oh, sorry, the question just disappeared. So you're interested in go ahead.
David, yeah, it's a very interesting talk. I just want to understand a bit more on the methods you have developed. We understand the limitations of access to field data on the crop yield or its quality in the developing countries. How do you see these methods are scalable, not from the remote sensing perspective, but more on data collection from the field?
Yeah.
And how does it look at in terms of the cost implications and the data collection over a period of years? So do you have any optimization method to look at that?
Yeah, I think part of the message that you could take away, and this is a message that I've pissed off some of my colleagues in the remote sensing world by saying, but like I'm of the view at this point that the way that the real constraint is training data, and that we need to sort of lower the standards on the training data. We need to experiment and really look at cheap ways of collecting lots of pretty good data, as opposed to very expensive campaigns to collect very high quality data. I think we need to reserve some budget to collect very high quality data to know how well we're doing in terms of evaluating the models. But I think that we need to be comfortable training on data that we know is not as good as it could be. And because that opens up a much lower cost strategy of, for example, using phones, using just roughly georeferenced data. It has to be within reason, and we have to understand where those limits are. But I think the crop cut is a good example. I probably 3 or 4 years ago thought that we should probably be moving towards doing whole field harvest or like very large crop cuts. And now I'm more of the mindset that if you can get a couple of 2x2 crop cuts and get 50 of them, you're probably going to be doing a pretty good job. And we should try to do that in more places as opposed to really optimizing the quality. So I think we at least need to separate in our minds how we think about training data and testing data, that they shouldn't be coming from actually the same sources. And that's, I think, how you would scale it most rapidly. But, obviously the standards are improving just in field data collection. So, I remember, and I'm going to date myself here, but I remember giving a talk to the CG system in 2004, and I was coming close to my PhD being finished. And there it was just like, it was a challenge to get people to georeference the field data they were collecting. And I was sort of pleading for them to, take along a GPS instrument and collect where you are. Now that doesn't, that seems to be the standard. And the only real issue is whether you can get access to it if it's their privacy concerns. So those kind of things are meaning that we have more and more data to train against anyway, but I think to really scale it, we have to, we have to collect data with the purpose of training, and that means that it doesn't have to be the same quality of data.
Great, thanks so much. So I think we are ready to move on to our next presentation. One thing to note is that there are a number of excellent questions both in the chat and in the Q&A. We are planning to have breakout sessions periodically throughout the workshop, and so I would encourage you to join the general one if your particular questions don't fit into one of the specific ones, and that will give you an opportunity to continue this conversation. Thanks so much, David.
Thanks.
So over to Jen Alix-Garcia. David, I believe you need to stop sharing your screen.
Okay, now I will find my screen share here. Okay, how does that look? Visible?
Yes,
Thank you,
that's great, Jen.
James. Okay. Thanks so much for having me here. I'm really sort of honored to be on the panel with David, whose work I've admired for a long time and who I've never actually spoken to. So it's sort of thrilling. And I think this is a great forum for having these conversations, and I'm looking forward to all of the interaction today. I want to take this space that I have to reflect on things, challenges and opportunities for bringing together remote sensing for policy analysis from my perspective as both an editor who sees a lot of papers that are written with remotely sensed outcomes or covariates, but also as a researcher who tries to use this data myself. So you wouldn't be here if you hadn't heard how amazing this stuff is. I mean, this is the topic of conversation here, and I think this is a wonderful direction for people who are interested in environmental and resource management questions, as well as a number of economic development questions. We now have global information on all kinds of measures of interesting stuff, land use and previously unobserved resource extraction, important determinants of economic activity like rainfall, temperature, and topography. And we should all be using this stuff, and I'm thrilled that SPIA is moving in this direction. This may seem a little repetitive to what David had said before, but I just think it's worth saying again that in contrast to a lot of the data that policy analysts use, which is household survey or administrative information collected by governments, these remotely sensed measures are superior in important ways. So you can see everywhere, you get huge samples, you don't have problems of sampling bias unless you create them yourselves. The resolution can be unbelievable. There aren't the same, it can be costly to create the measures, but it doesn't have the same kind of enumeration costs and non-response bias that can come with direct field work talking to households. And there are no bureaucrats fiddling with measures, which is sometimes a worry when you're working in certain countries. And the figure that you see here on the left is just a testament to the fact that there are a lot of players in this field now, and that you can get information on surprising places. So this is an image from Facebook's population measure, and it's showing you gridded population at a 30-meter level for the Democratic Republic of Congo. So this slide is a little bit speaking to the people in the crowd who might be creators of this data. I think David clearly has a grasp on this, but I sometimes when I talk to geographers, some of these things aren't clear, and I think it's worth pointing out what we're doing with the data as policy analysts. So most policy analysts are interested in making comparisons in a particular way, and what's going on in our brains, no matter what identification strategy we're using, is something like this, where you have time on the x-axis and outcomes on the y-axis. And what you want is to be able to compare a group that is affected by your project or policy with a group that is not affected over time. And you want to know, in particular, this line here, you need to know when that's happening in the remotely sensed data. So you want a strategy where you have a reason why units are in one group or the other, and a specific time period in which you expect an intervention to have an effect. And this is important for having conversations about how you want to develop data. And it means that having attribution of specific dates for when a layer is created is really important. It's hard to analyze the effect of a policy that takes place in a specific point in time when, for example, the remotely sensed measure comes from an amalgamation of images from multiple time periods. Even in the sort of regression discontinuity setting that David was showing earlier, it's also useful to have panel information. So having remotely sensed data that is consistently produced over multiple time periods is also immensely useful. And in the event that you need to mosaic images from different time periods or different sensors to create an outcome of interest, it's important that the policy analyst knows that that has happened and can identify the places where that has happened, because that can help us deal with potential measurement error in the outcomes that we're looking at. And finally, another really important thing for remote sensors who are creating data that might be used in policy analysis is that it's really helpful to have a transparent description of where classifications perform well and where they perform less well, because this can vary over space in important ways that can affect impact estimation. So that the average accuracy is important to know, but also important is whether that accuracy varies over topography or time or other covariates of interest. And it's also useful to understand how much aggregation might help this problem. Okay, so that was my speech to the creators of data. Now I want to speak a little bit more directly to users of data who might be either working directly with remote sensors or just downloading data, that because there's so much available now that you could just whoop, all of a sudden you have it on your computer and you can use it. And these are a few, now I'm going to talk about a few challenges that I see repeatedly as an editor. So one of the things that is important to have a conversation about as an analyst is that you understand the outcome that you're looking at. So I think all the people in this crowd understand this right now, but direct raw imagery or readings from sensors are not actually usable data sets and require translation, whose process it's important to get a grasp on. Changes in NDVI do not mean deforestation. Changes in nighttime lights do not mean poverty alleviation. And I think there has been a tendency in the analyst world to sometimes take these measures without fully grasping what exactly they indicate. And obviously the work that David just showed us together with the Marshall Burke team is directly addressing this question and trying to make more direct measures of some of these outcomes of interest. The second big challenge that I see is around the issue of spatial aggregation. So spatial data can be aggregated and scaled in many ways, and actually has to be in order for you to analyze it, because you might want to connect it with other information like household data or government administrative level data. This leads to a well-known problem in geography, which is called the modifiable aerial unit problem, wherein the same data can yield different results when you aggregate it in different ways. So a very relevant example of this right now is gerrymandering. So on the right-hand side of this slide, you can sort of see how this process might work. This is Mexico. We have here measures of elevation at the pixel level, aggregated up to grid cells, and then all of a sudden reclassified at the municipal level, which is a political unit that depends upon other things like population. So you lose a lot of information in this process and can find different answers. And actually, Kathy Baylis has a really cool paper looking at this problem. The third challenge that I see frequently when I'm reading work that uses these kind of outcomes is around weighting. So this may seem like kind of an uninteresting technical issue, but it's important in situations where your units of analysis might vary considerably in size. So there's an example of this on the right-hand side of the slide. These are different polygons that represent properties and pieces of properties that participate in conservation programs. And it's entirely possible that if you do not weight estimations by area when you're analyzing something like this, you'll get quite a different effect than if you do weight by area. It's similar to the issue of analyzing reductions in the number of poor people in the world if you weight by population, wherein China has a really big effect because it has the most people, relative to a case where you don't weight by population. And you might be interested in different things at different moments of your analysis, but it's important to be clear that if you are examining units without weighting, you're looking at the average effect across units, whereas when you weight, you're looking at the average effect across area. The fourth challenge that I see has to do with spatial correlation, and many people in the crowd, especially geographers or remote sensors, are very aware of this, that there's a lot of correlation across space. So here you can see these are different parcels of land that have enrolled in conservation program over time, where the warmer colors are early enrollees and the cooler colors are later ones. And you can see how that process is clustered and grows. And so as you're looking at your data, you should keep in mind that just because you can cut the space into zillions of observations, it doesn't mean they're all independent. And taking into account those relationships when you are then analyzing policy impact can also make a big difference. So the last challenge that I want to talk about is related to some of what David said before, and also to a new paper that I've been working on with Dan Millimet, who is out there in the crowd. And this is around measurement error. So we often believe that variables are normally distributed, and so is error. And we similarly sometimes claim that error in the dependent variable is a non-issue. However, in satellite-based outcomes, and actually in many sorts of outcomes, you can easily have non-classical measurement error, which in fact does mess with what you're interested in. So in this paper that Dan and I have been working on, we discuss how measurement error might enter into remotely sensed data. And we also look at an example of where we try to show that this error could potentially be non-classical in the way that it's correlated with space, and also in the way that the variables are specified. And then we propose an estimation technique that is useful when you're using a binary outcome obtained from remotely sensed data. And we do both a simulation to assess how well this fixes the problem of measurement error, and we also apply this estimator to assess the impact of forest conservation payments in Mexico. In order to illustrate the fact that you can have two remotely sensed measures that could be suffering from non-classical measurement error, we compared two different data sets that are measuring forest cover in Mexico around 2010. These data sets use the same input in terms of the type of imagery. They use different methodologies, but they're looking at approximately the same time period. So we put a set of grid cells across Mexico that are 5 by 5 kilometers in size, and we aggregate the forest measures up to that level. And we also count the number of cloud-free Landsat images that are available over this time in order to think about correlates of measurement error, with the idea that if you have more images, this gives you more information to create classifications. What we find is that if you just look at whether or not each data set classifies a given 5-kilometer cell of as having forest or not, in 2010, they agree 85% of the time. So there's pretty strong but not perfect correlation between these two measures of the same thing. We do find that if you look at the continuous measure, one of these outcomes measures almost twice as much area of forest on average per cell. So they disagree more in the continuous measure than in the discrete one. And if you look at the correlates of these disagreements, they're systematically related to important geographic features, the number of cloud-free images that are available from the Landsat archive, and also the interaction between these two. So that suggests to us that there is measurement error that is correlated across important geographic features, which actually in the Mexican context, which we're looking at, is also correlated with conservation programs. So we propose a solution where we are focusing on the situation of a binary outcome that suffers from non-classical error. And the reason why this error is non-classical is both because the outcome is binary, so that naturally generates a non-classical error, but also because the measurement depends on environmental factors, many of which affect land use classifications broadly. Our solution uses a modification of the estimation strategy for a binary dependent variable, which adjusts the probability function that you use to estimate by taking into account the fact that there could be measurement error that is correlated with geography and image availability. So we also can modify this likelihood function to adjust for the issue that in many cases when you're analyzing environmental outcomes, you're looking at relatively rare events. Just to summarize what we find in our simulation, we show that if you're just looking at the treatment effect, the estimators that adjust for measurement error are much better than those that don't. So if you examine the root mean squared error for the treatment effect, it's up to 15 times higher in estimators that do not adjust for measurement error than it would have been in the best model. We also show that the approach of adding covariates that might be related to misclassification does not improve the performance of models. So this is something that I have done as a researcher and also that other people sometimes do. Somewhat disturbingly, we see that measurement error does not necessarily lead to attenuation of impact in this particular setting. We can't differentiate whether that's because of the binary feature of the model or because of the correlation between misclassification and geography, but it is an outcome of this process. And we show that our estimators that do account for measurement error perform pretty well. We also apply this estimator to some real data. We look at the impact of forest conservation payments in Mexico, where we're analyzing all of the land that ever applied for this program over this time period, using as an outcome deforestation measured from the Hansen data set from the University of Maryland. We use kind of standard panel data techniques, but we adjust the estimation strategy to account for possible measurement error that might be correlated with the number of cloud-free images and their interaction with geography. The results from this application show that the program does reduce deforestation and actually significantly does so across all of the estimation strategies that we use, but that the estimated impacts are larger when we correct for misclassification. Because the model simultaneously estimates the probability of false positives and false negatives, we're able to make a guess about how much misclassification there is in the remotely sensed data. So we see that in 17% of the polygons that we analyze, we observe deforestation. But when we take into account misclassification, we estimate that actually there should have been estimated deforestation in 34% of the polygons. So this may seem like a large amount of misclassification, but it's actually not inconsistent with people who've looked at the accuracy of this particular outcome in other tropical settings. So just to conclude, there are huge possibilities for using this kind of data, and it's better if you can collaborate directly with the people who are creating it. And as we analyze it, it's important to keep in mind the variety of issues, and probably others. I'm sure other people have other interesting stuff that they worry about in the analysis of this kind of data. But what I'm worried about is what the outcome actually measures, how aggregation might affect the results, whether or not you should be weighting, spatial correlation in the outcome variable, and measurement error. So I'm happy to answer questions about any of those things and looking forward to the rest of the discussion today.
Thanks a lot, Jen. So we'll use the same mechanic as in the previous session. So a mix of the written questions, but also if you want to ask live questions, just raise your hand and we can open the floor. And so while people are figuring out how to raise their hands, let me ask maybe, Rashid, you want to ask your question live? In which case you should unmute yourself. Can you, yeah.
Okay, I think I muted myself. No, just I've seen this problem a lot in student thesis or this, that the observations are not IID, and indeed because they have thousands or millions of observations, they often get levels of significance that are ultra high, precisely because they don't, because there's a lot of repeated observations. So it does raise this concern about observations not being IID, and thus is the solution only clustering? It seems to still lead to very, very high significance levels, sometimes with results that can still jump from positive to negative. So there is a feeling that I don't know properly how to deal with it. What's the right recommendation? Is clustering enough to solve this problem?
That's a good question, Rashid. It's nice to hear you, by the way. It's been a long time.
Thank you.
I am not an expert in this, but I do think that clustering helps. And there are other ways to deal with spatial correlation. So you can use these sort of spatially weighted standard errors, and you can examine what happens if you cluster at different levels. So clustering is basically like saying, oh, I believe there's arbitrary correlation within this space. So the larger you make the space, the more arbitrary correlation you allow for. And that can't help but help the spatial correlation issue, but you can also try to model it directly with a Conley standard error type thing or other kinds of weighting matrices in the standard errors. But yeah, what I see frequently is that, oh my gosh, I have a million observations, so every single thing is statistically significant, which it's not.
Which makes the students very happy.
I know, but then they get sad when they discover that they shouldn't have done that. So we want to avoid that.
Excellent, thanks. So again, raise your hands if you want to jump in. And in the meantime, let me ask a question, Jen, on the measurement error part of things. So, when you, on your list of, things for the people generating data, unless I missed it, I don't think we have on there, give us more information of the source of measurement error. Is that something that, maybe I missed it, but if not, should it be there? And is that something that in your experience is feasible or not?
Well, so I was attempting to allude to that when I said that it would be nice to have information about how well the accuracy of a particular classification performs across space. That's what I was meaning to say.
Okay,
and
so you go a step further, like you could kind of, ask people to say more about the potential sources, at least.
Yeah, I mean, we were sort of, it's easier to, I haven't worked a lot with these more fine scale data sets, but it's easy with the Landsat data to just sort of figure out how many inputs go in. And I think that's probably, there are probably better ways to do that than, and people who make the data know what other kinds of things create measurement error at the sensor type level. So
we have a question from Stephen Wilcox. If you again unmute yourself, I think. You should unmute, yeah.
There we go. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, Jen. My name is Stephen Wilcox. I'm a PhD candidate, and I work with Chris on the IBLI project. I wanted to zero in on the weighting issue a little bit. So I'm not aware of anybody who's addressed best practices from a weighting perspective with remote sensing data. There's folks that have started to write some papers on this from, like, say, when do you weight by population and so forth. And in Kathy's paper on the modifiable aerial unit problem, there's the nice suggestion that comes out of her work for estimating at different levels of aggregation and seeing how results change. And I was wondering if you have any comments as far as best practices go when it comes to weighting, when it's good to focus on the say the polygon unit versus area and other forms of weighting even.
That's such a good question. I wish I had an awesome answer for it. I guess my my first suggestion would be to think about whether you are, if you're analyzing at the decision maker level, so you're looking at how people make choices across their agricultural fields, and different landowners have different field sizes, you might be interested in the unweighted version of that estimation because you want to know what the landowner level response is to some sort of policy. And that's like looking at the impact of the savings rate on economic growth or something, right? Because the institution of interest is at that level, you're not as interested in the kind of population average effect. But if you want to know how the forest or how the overall agricultural yields total at the average across hectares rather than the average at the decision maker level is affected, then you do want to weight. I mean, I haven't actually read anything written on that, but I think the principles, there's an Angus Deaton article in QJE about weighting by population that came out a long time ago in understanding the reduction of poverty across time in the world. And that's what I think about when I'm thinking about whether or not I want to weight. There's also an article called What Are We Waiting For? WEIGHTING, that I don't know if it's been published somewhere, but it's around it's Wooldridge and somebody else. That's useful.
It's in JHR.
Oh, okay.
So we have in the chat, in the Q&A, in fact, something I first want to point out because I forgot earlier. There's somebody logged on, or maybe more than one person, as anonymous attendee, which is not great. So if you can change your name, then we all know who is writing things and in terms of collegiality. And then if you do that, you could ask your question also in addition, because you can't do that right now. And so maybe while while we are waiting to see whether that person reappears, Patrick, Meha, do you want to elaborate a bit on what you wrote in the chat?
Yeah, well, I didn't have so much more to say unless we start to elaborate for a much longer time on spatial autocorrelation issue. I was just saying that the very basic, crudest way to start dealing with spatial autocorrelation issues is to resample and, well, sample your data with the minimal distance criteria to make sure to have samples that are separated by a sufficiently large distance that you can assess to make sure that they are as less as possible spatially autocorrelated. But of course, if you really do that in a very strict way, then you often reduce your super high samples to very small samples. But it's just to say that it is probably the the safety net that you can always do in case you don't have anything else. But my second part in my response was, I don't know how it plays out. We can do this in the more counterfactual based identification approach, but in regression approach, there are ways to incorporate your spatial autocorrelation in the model in ways that are in some cases can be more interesting than just trying to avoid and control for it and put it aside, but where you can actually reveal how your spatial autocorrelation is not just a measurement error, but it's actually a spatial dependence in the data where the outcome in one place can influence the outcome in another place and so on. And that can reveal a lot about the processes themselves if you can actually incorporate it instead of just controlling for it.
That makes sense. Thanks a lot, Patrick. So with that, I think we've reached the end of this session. That I think I enjoyed these two sessions a lot. It's very stimulating, lots of ideas. I know there's a few more questions pending, but again, we'll have breakouts where we can come back to those. So let's, I think we have a little break scheduled now, and then we take in, I guess, 9 minutes from now with some further presentations. Thank you.
Can we reconvene? Nodding from Santa Barbara, that's great. Kelsey, shall I introduce Kunwar? I'll hand over to Kunwar. Okay, Kunwar, I see you're unmuted. That's great. We have two presentations. One from Kunwar Singh from AData, followed by Ying Sun from Cornell, and 20 minutes for each. And then following that, we will then close this and go into breakout sessions for discussions on the two topics that they present. So starting with Kunwar, you have 20 minutes. Thanks so much.
Thank you, James.
Great.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending my talk. It is a pleasure to be here, and thank you for having me. I will share with you a zoomed out overview of land change measurements in semi-arid region and some emerging issues with applications to give you an idea how remote sensing can be applied to semi-arid land change science. While this talk will be light on methods and applications, I will be happy to answer any questions about how things can be done or how things are done or can be done as I go through the presentation. To put my talk in the context, in the map, what you see are long-term global land change estimates. Color represents either land conversion or modification. Circles represent the direction of land change. One aspect of this map is obvious. Land change is pervasive, so are its impact on natural resources. Some climatic regions are more prone to land change and environmental impact than others. For example, semi-arid regions. This map shows the global distribution of semi-arid regions. This includes both hot and cold climates. The North American prairies is an example of cold semi-arid region. Hot semi-arid climates are found around the fringes of subtropical deserts, such as the Sahel region in Africa that stretches from Senegal in the west and Somalia in the east. Semi-arid soils are considered hot spots due to their importance for crop production and human food security. Semi-arid climate receives low precipitation, but not as low as desert climate, and therefore it tends to support short, scrubby vegetation and are usually dominated by either grass or shrubs. This precipitation fluctuates in semi-arid regions, which often leads to drought. An example, this would be the Sahel region in sub-Saharan Africa. The Sahel had above average rainfall from 1940 to 1970, but since 1970, rainfall has been below average which has ruined farms and forced people to move. While semi-arid region is considered as a hotspot for crop production, its fragile ecosystems makes it vulnerable to disturbances, which are mostly caused by agricultural activities. Wind and water erosion disturbance is on the top. If surface vegetation is removed either due to deforestation or agricultural activities such as grazing, both dryness and excessive water leads to soil erosion. Likewise, excessive use of water and fertilizer over time leads to salt buildup in soils that causes salinity and toxicity in crops. Salinity suppresses crop growth and reduces crop yield. Semi-arid landscapes are favorable for ranching. However, if it is not managed properly, it leads to overgrazing, which causes loss of soil organic content. Overall, in the long run, soil erosion, salinity, overgrazing causes a decline in soil structure and loss of soil water storage. We may not think this region as having excessive land change, but it is a region that has been impacted by land change processes and climate change. One of the best historical examples of how land change and disturbance coupled with climate change in semi-arid regions could risk global food security is the Dust Bowl era in the United States. The Dust Bowl was a period of severe dust storms that significantly damaged the ecology and agriculture of the North American prairies during the 1930s. Settlers plowed the prairie, seeded wheat, and controlled weeds, which pulverized the soil, removed surface vegetation, and increased the risk of erosion. The impact of these agricultural practices and a multi-year drought resulted in Dust Bowl. This is just an example of how an interplay between land and climate change could lead to a devastating environmental impact and risk global food security. Unless significant shift in land convergence and management are undertaken in the region, land change could have a more noticeable ecological impact than climate change. Therefore, we must find a balance between consumption and conversion of land if we are to meet ever-growing human demands in a sustainable manner. Therefore, for the long-term sustainability of semi-arid regions, we must explore three challenges. Understand spatial and temporal patterns of deforestation and agrification to determine where, why, and at what rate changes is occurring. Understand the patterns of disturbance regime due to deforestation and agrification. Study the broad scale ecological and environmental implications of land change in a changing climate. So for the first challenge, the knowledge of spatial and temporal patterns of land change is essential to determine where, why, and at what rate land change is occurring. This requires developing land change products. Some remote sensing data, as David and Jennifer mentioned, provide huge spatial coverage. Some have high temporal coverage, and others provide excellent spectral qualities. However, it is hard to have data from one sensor that fulfills the need of desirable spatial, spectral, and temporal resolution at once. This study is an example where authors used 2-time step satellite imagery to study land change and carbon flux in East Africa. Now we are in position to study land change at daily and weekly intervals from local to global scale due to free availability of aerial and satellite remote sensing imagery, contrary to just 2-time step in the past. However, there are few issues. Often land change patches in semi-arid landscape, particularly developing countries, are smaller than the size of Landsat and Sentinel pixels. Besides, These data are riddled with spectral similarity, mixed pixels, and a generalized representation of Earth surfaces. These issues make it very challenging to efficiently utilize Landsat and Sentinel sensors to estimate fine-scale changes for desirable periods. To overcome this challenge, we can combine two or more data sets to produce land change product at desirable spatial and temporal scales. For example, researchers have used Landsat and MODIS data to achieve a daily temporal resolution. The same way, Landsat and Sentinel have been used together to fill spatial and temporal gaps for producing land change products. Availability of fusion frameworks and high resolution imagery such as planetoscope can help to improve spatial and spectral resolution to capture a small extent land change such as crop types and even distribution of semi-lunes in semi-arid landscape. Just to recap this challenge, using free availability of wide range of satellite imagery and advanced fusion algorithms, we can create data set with high spatial, spectral, and temporal resolution to study land change from deforestation and agrification. For the second challenge, understanding the disturbance in response to land and climate change is essential for conservation and management of semi-arid environment. Deforestation and agrification can lead to a variety of disturbances such as soil erosion, salinity, reduced soil water storage, and loss of surface organic content. There are a variety of aerial and satellite remote sensing data are available. We can use to create land change product, time series land change product that can be used to study soil erosion, salinity, even crop and grass productivities over time. For example, elevation data can be used to study soil moisture and soil roughness because of once vegetation is removed. Among all disturbances, soil erosion is the most common and severe that can lead to loss of surface organic content and slow forest regeneration. There are multiple ways to study soil erosion. For example, we can statistically link soil surface reflectance data with spectral bands from high resolution imagery to map exposed soil surface. We can even use soil and imaging spectroscopy to study soil surface properties. Interferometry SAR, synthetic aperture radar, can be used to develop more elevation models or to detect small surface movement in centimeters. This data from interferometry SAR can be used to create two-time step elevation, and that can help to detect soil loss of soil surfaces from erosion. Likewise, vegetation phenology can be used to study grassland productivity and soil salinity, including detection and mapping of invasive plants, which are quite common problem in many landscapes globally. Vegetation phenology is the timing of seasonal development stages in plant life cycle that includes green up, canopy growth, flowering, and senescence. For example, we developed phenology of Chinese privet, which is an invasive in the eastern part of the United States, using time series remote sensing imagery to identify time step when phenology difference between Chinese privet and native vegetation was high. This approach helped us to achieve highest detection accuracy. In the figure, what you see, it provides it is basically developed based on time series NDVI, and you can see the clear differences between Chinese privet and native evergreen and deciduous. Chinese privet is in a black color, and evergreen and deciduous are in green and orange color. Likewise, vegetation phenology can be used to study grassland productivity. Similar approach can be used to establish duration when grass productivity is highest for grazing in the various part of the grassland. Time series NDVI and reflectance value may also help identify areas that has developed salinity over time. Since salinity reduces crop, even grass productivity gradually, that can be captured through time series satellite imagery analysis. Space-bound synthetic aperture radar data can be used for mapping and monitoring of vegetation dynamics, such as impact of drought on communal and commercial grassland. To recap this challenge, we are in position where we have a variety of remote sensing data, methods, and applications to estimate various land change-induced disturbance regimes. Vegetation phenology and time series vegetation indices can be used to detect invasive plants, soil salinity, and vegetation productivities. The third challenge, interplay between disturbance regime, land, and climate change impacts natural resources that leads to reduced crop yield and long-term ecological damages. Water is one of the natural resources that is heavily impacted by land change and disturbance. Satellite imagery with the surface energy balance model can be used to estimate daily evapotranspiration of each vegetation types. The similar approach can be used to estimate water demands of each crop types to manage water resource efficiently. For example, in this study, my co-partners and I used Landsat imagery to estimate daily evapotranspiration using surface energy model to estimate water uptake of Chinese privet compared to native deciduous and evergreen. Looking at the plot of daily average evapotranspiration of Chinese privet, evergreen, and deciduous forest type for the driest, wettest, and normal years, you will notice higher ET from Chinese privet during the drier and normal precipitation years, which suggest that invasive plant takes more water when the native plant needs it the most. Likewise, reliance on subsurface water for irrigation often leads to depletion of aquifers. Now we have satellites such as GRACE that can be used to estimate seasonal water storage changes due to weather, climate, changing season, and human activities. GRACE stands for Gravity Recovery and Climate Experiment. The figure you see here shows the terrestrial water storage during October and May in Africa. If you see the May figure, you will notice that there is a water shortage / stress in the Sahel region of Africa. A majority of fresh water globally is used in agricultural activities. Therefore, efforts are made to achieve more crops per drop to increase water efficiency. Like daily evapotranspiration, SWOT, which stands for Soil and Water Analysis Tool, can be used to estimate water efficiency of crops. Satellite imagery derived land use data is a key input. For example, we performed a study where almond crop was replaced with a vineyard in Modesto, California to study water savings. Just to let you know, almond requires more water compared to vineyard. What we learned is that if we replace almond entirely, we may save almost 38% of total water used for almond cropping. This is just an example how we can use remote sensing along with tools, various tools to study land change impact and maximize water resources for long-term sustainability in semi-arid regions. With this, I will conclude my talk with some summary remark. Using a wide range of satellite imageries and advanced fusion algorithms, researchers can develop land change product with high spatial, spectral, and temporal resolution to study deforestation and agrification in semi-arid landscape. Time-series land change products such as vegetation phenology and NDVI can be utilized to understand the disturbance for conservation and management of semi-arid environment. A variety of remote sensing data, methods, and applications are available to estimate various land change-induced disturbances. Interplay between disturbance regime, land, and climate change impact natural resources, which reduces crop yields, impact natural resources, and long-term ecology. Remote sensing product, along with the various modeling tools, can be used to assess the impacts of interplay between disturbance regime, land, and climate change for the long-term sustainability of semi-arid regions. Well, thank you.
Kunwar, thank you very much for that wonderful overview of the topics here and sticking to time so admirably. For those of you with comments, questions on Kunwar's talk, we will have a breakout session coming up. They're going to be facilitated by Robert Hellmeyer, and there's a link on the agenda if you choose to join that breakout to pursue discussion further on the topics raised by Kunwar. So we won't take questions at this point. We'll proceed directly to our next presentation, which is by Ying Sun on the topic of land degradation. Ying, you have 20 minutes. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. So can everyone see my screen well? Okay. Sure. Thank you. First of all, I would really appreciate this opportunity to present our work funded by SPIA, led by Chris Barrett, on the rangeland house impact of rangeland house from the EBLE. But I would like to first talk about the remote sensing assessment for land degradation, which is a topic I was asked to present. Although we admit that we acknowledge that land degradation is a much broader scope than what we are interested in our project, which is a rangeland house impacted by EBLE implementation. Okay, and also this is also my first time participating this workshop, and so I'm learning a lot from the economist and the remote sensing scientist from this workshop. Okay, so let me first give a brief overview of the remote sensing, using remote sensing techniques to evaluate the land degradation. Here, I would like to focus more on the from the perspective of vegetation. Although land degradation has a much broader scope covering, like, for example, soil erosion, but here I would like to talk more about on the vegetation side. So this is a very nice review published in past few years, which synthesize the past studies that use a number of different satellite measurement, also in conjunction with point sampling, that to assess land degradation at multiple temporal and spatial scales. Most often there is a trade-off between temporal and spatial resolution, but of course, as Dave showed earlier, that the planning scope is really like a game changer, which has a very frequent temporal visit and also very high temporal resolution. But for these freely available satellite measurement in the past, this has been used for long-term land degradation assessment. And they have been applied to different scales depending on their spatial resolution and those specific questions that is being asked. So these are different applications at different scales. So here the H represent the human activities, E representing environmental changes. So these satellite observations have been used to try to understand the underlying mechanisms driven by human activities or environmental changes. And such activities or environmental changes can be manifested at different scales. Okay, so in the past, majority of the land degradation assessment has been focused on using NDVI, a normalized difference vegetation index, as proxy for biomass or net primary production NPP here. Because this is the NDVI from the free available satellite that has the longest time series, say from NOAA satellite of the AVHR sensor. And it is also very simple and easy to understand. So that's why the NDVI has been predominantly used for assessing the long-term land degradation for vegetation. So this map shows that there's substantial degradation in grassland and shrubland in sub-Saharan Africa. But even though studies have been trying to correct the environmental influence, for example, rainfall variability and trend, and also CO2 fertilization and nitrogen fertilization effect from human activities. But the methods are also have limitations in really try to rigorously disentangle climate variability and human activity and human influences. So one major problem is like the greenness itself has limited capability to assessing land degradation. This figure shows that if we measure a soil spectral, the NDVI for soil, so basically there's no vegetation cover, but you can still see this vegetation indices, this cross here, that changes with soil brightness. So that means greenness is the NDVI is sensitive to both soil brightness and the vegetation cover changes due to land degradation, okay? And also studies have been using photosynthetic vegetation and non-photosynthetic vegetation as metrics to evaluate land degradation, but either a PV or NPV alone cannot distinguish among different land degradation stages, because you can see they are highly clustered. There is a high overlap between different land degradation stages. But a combination of this PV and NPV, which represent the total vegetation cover, that can collectively, that can better differentiate different land degradation stages. So from this figure, you can see that different degradation stages that they can be better differentiated. Another important issue that can often be overlooked is that what is mostly often used for land degradation, that is called like canopy FPAR, which is highly related to NDVI, that is called the fraction of absorbed photosynthetically active radiation. But what we are interested in is actually foliage FPAR, which is directly related to vegetation structure and function. So from this figure, you can see there's a clear difference between the two, and such differences also differ among different land degradation categories. So this is a very important issue, especially in semi-arid regions with open canopies or with the exposure of non-photosynthetic vegetations. The two can be significantly different. So here are the challenges summarized by this review paper. I have talked about this NDVI problems and also the data and the method used for disentangle human influence and climate impact, which can suffer problems due to the differential response of vegetation to rainfall. So the analysis of these drivers can have issues because it's difficult to decouple the environmental signal due to long-term climate variability from the human activities. For example, whether it's due to rainfall decline or due to overgrazing. Okay, and also another challenge is that it's very hard to validate the long-term trend because we do not have long enough and with high quality in situ measurement that can be used to validate this long-term satellite measurement. Okay. So in the rest of the talk, I'm going to be focusing on our project, which we try to circumvent some of these, if not all, but some of these technical issues. Okay. So our project is to assess the impact from this index-based livestock insurance (EBLA) on the rangeland health in Ethiopia and Kenya. So the question we're after from the remote sensing aspect is that what are the pre and post EBLA trend in the rangeland condition in our study area, and whether what these observed changes from the remote sensing measurement are indicative of. Is that suggesting improving or declining rangeland health, or can we can we disentangle the rapid and slow onset of different due to different mechanisms? Okay. So this is a brief introduction of our study area in Ethiopia and Kenya. So each black shape polygon represents this special index insurance unit, and the green polygons represent the uninsured controlled areas, which can help us to disentangle the underlying climate variability and the EBLA implementation. So I'm going to mainly talk about our preliminary analysis in our test area in southern Ethiopia, which we have intensive ground measurement. So we proposed a bunch of rangeland health indices here, which is adopted from very well established field measurement for land degradation metrics from this version 5 pilot 2018. And the key here is that we would like to transform these well-established field-based indicators into the remote sensing space, which has never been done before at a large scale anywhere in the world. So here we would like to focus on some key indicators. One is the bare ground, which is very sensitive to characterize the soil exposure, and we would also like to look at the photosynthetic vegetation and the non-photosynthetic vegetation along with bare ground, as I discussed before. And on top of that, we would also try to look at some novel and new satellite measurement, for example, solar-induced chlorophyll fluorescence, which is a more direct proxy for photosynthesis or productivity. So here in the rest of talk, I'm going to focus on two tasks. One is the land cover classification, and one is fractional cover analysis in order to get this bare ground soil and the PV and NPV quantification. And I'm going to also talk a little bit about the fluorescence. So here the issue is that we want to do a land classification first in order to understand the long-term changes of the transition changes among different land cover types, and also the bare ground soil information can tell us the seasonal changes at a shorter time scale. Okay. So here, once we zoom into our test area in Barossa zone, here we have a lot of ground truths acquired in 2013, and we have around 1,800 ground photos. And after some quality filtering, only have like 14 samples, which is to feel if we want to train for the land cover classification and fractional cover analysis. So our strategy is to leverage our high resolution imageries from NGA, which is available to our USDA member, which is who is on our team, Patrick Clark. So the goal here is to try to enhance the amount of labels for training and validation. Okay. So here are the high resolution imagery. So so far we only use 70 mosaic strips, and this covers this area. And in total, we generate almost 70,000 high resolution imageries when and wherever they are available. Okay. So the first task is that we would like to do the land cover classification for Landsat using the high resolution imageries, the training labels generated from high resolution imageries along with the ground truth point, because Landsat is the only available dataset that can provide you long enough temporal coverage and also with fine enough spatial resolution. And from this land cover classes, you can see that this is a very complicated definition for each of that. So in total, we have 8 classes. If I zoom into one that which is open canopy woodland, here this is a photo provided by our collaborator. We can see that there is a very sophisticated definition of the percentage of tree cover, shrub cover, and the bare ground. So the first thing we have to do is to first classify the high resolution imageries into these basic vegetation types, trees, shrub, grassland, and etc. And once we have this information, we can calculate the percentage and use that as a training label to train Landsat. Okay, so the step 1 is that we classify the vegetation types with the high resolution images. And so this is our preliminary results with this 4 basic types in this region. And the next step is that we try to generate training labels from high resolution imageries. So here for each ground point here, we have this 30-meter radius. And then we then calculated the percentage for each vegetation types. With this calculated percentage and our corresponding table, we can assign the land cover classes defined in the previous table. And with this defined assigned classes, this is for each point we can have generate such classes so that this can be used for as training labels for Landsat. Okay, so here again, I just want to show the total labels here, and we use 90% for training and 10% for validation. Okay, this is the final classified land cover using Landsat. This figure shows the land cover changes in the shorter range season between 2013 to 2018 using Landsat 8. So clearly you can see that there is a substantial changes in terms of land cover classes. In terms of the classification accuracy, we based on the validation set, we see the overall accuracy is quite promising. Of course, we're also going to continue increasing our measurement, our training labels. And so for individual types, we see this crop land has the lowest accuracy simply because we don't have many training labels. But for others, our training accuracies, classification accuracies are quite promising. And we also compare the accuracy as a function of training sizes. And we also compare if we just use the ground truth dataset for training versus high resolution plus ground training, ground label trainings. We see a substantial improvement in terms of the classification accuracy. Okay. Then next, we would like to do fractional cover analysis using spectral unmixing. Again, because the combination of background of photosynthetic vegetation and non-photosynthetic vegetation are key parameters for the rangeland health indicators. Okay, to do that, we again use high resolution imageries to help us identify relative homogeneous areas for background and photosynthetic vegetation, so that we can establish the basic spectral for different AND members. Here we have these 3 AND members. So with that AND member, we can try to unmix these 3 AND members using the well-established spatial unmixing method. So here are some preliminary results. So we can see the signal variation in these 3 parameters from the shorter rain season, November 2013, to the next dry season. Okay, clearly you can see an increase of bare ground. Okay. And this is another example in another year. Again, we can see this clearly seasonal, very prominent seasonal changes. Okay, so. And next, I would like to talk about the solar-induced chlorophyll fluorescence, which is something that I have been working on in the past few years. So why we want to use that, what is the advantage compared to the traditional vegetation index, is that the fluorescence is emitted during the photosynthetic process. So that is the far more mechanistic proxy than vegetation index for photosynthesis. So the advantage of that, especially in semi-arid regions, that it is driven purely by foliar part, but not by any background materials, okay? And so it is not influenced by background soil because the soil does not emit fluorescence at all. So we demonstrate that in one of the papers that my student was leading, and we use that, we demonstrate this in the dry land along the gradient of the Northern Australia tropical transect. So you can see that from the coastal area to the inland area, there is a very pronounced rainfall decrease. So there's a rainfall gradient. And of course, the different vegetation types from the coastal to the inland areas, okay? And this is a busy plot, but the take-home message is that when we compare with ground measurement from adequate towers of photosynthetic fluxes, what we found is that in terms of the phenology, for example, the starting of the growing season and end of the growing season, which is very hard to be characterized using traditional vegetation index, and the SIF is doing much better job across the entire rainfall gradient from the humid, coastal humid regions to the very, the inland, very dry vegetation types, okay? And this can perform the enhanced vegetation index and an RV, which is recently a newly proposed vegetation index.
Sorry, just a quick time check. It's about time to move into the breakout room. So okay. Can you take just a moment to wrap up? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. This is my last slide. Okay, so the key message here is that the SIF-based characterization of phenology is very different from the traditional vegetation index, and this is such a bias is largely due to the soil exposure. Okay. And finally, I would like to thank my team. This is a really good learning process for me. Okay, thank you.
Perfect. Thanks so much. Sorry to interrupt. Yeah, no so we'll have the chance actually to continue this great conversation that you've kicked off, and there's some pent up questions that have been coming up in the Q&A. So I've just posted the links to all of the breakout rooms in the chat window. All of you should have gotten that. They're also all linked on the agenda. The way that we're going to run this is, if you're interested in following up on some of the topics that came up in the specific conversations on land use and land cover change that we heard previously, or land degradation that we just heard, please join those rooms. Your comments, questions, etc., can go well beyond what was presented, but we're trying to keep those rooms thematic in nature. If you have more general questions, topics for discussion, etc., please join the general discussion breakout session. Quick point on kind of the objectives of these more thematic rooms is, as James described during the introduction, one of the goals of this workshop is for the particular funded projects to be getting some feedback and getting some engagement on the methodological issues they're wrestling with. So the moderators in each of those rooms will first give some space to the PIs and others involved in those projects, as well as other participants in the breakout rooms, but certainly there should be time for general conversation. At the end of the breakout rooms, you can take a short break, and then we will all reconvene back here for a couple of additional thematic talks. Thanks so much. Well, thanks so much for reconvening and for the active participation in the breakout rooms. What we're going to be doing now is 2 additional thematic talks. We're starting a couple of minutes late, so we will respect the 20 minutes that each of the speakers have and take those 2 minutes out of the next breakout room sessions. So first we have Binayak Mohanty speaking about soil moisture across scales. Over to you. Has Binayak made it back into this room?
No, not yet. It
I
seems
spoke
like.
too soon. Let's see.
Chris probably has some good jokes for us.
You could switch the order of the talks.
Not at all.
Is Meha back? Yeah,
Yep,
Meha's
I'm
back.
here. I'm happy to go.
Okay, let's try that. Thanks a lot, Meha.
Yeah, no problem. All right, let me see if I can.
I don't know if you saw Patrick's point that it's possible that he logged in through the wrong link.
I don't see him in either, but I will keep a lookout for that. Thanks, Chris.
Oops. All right, like David, I should know how to do this all from now, by now since it's been 8 months, but bear with me. All right. Can everyone see this?
Yep.
Perfect. So I'm Meha Jain. I'm an assistant professor in the School for Environment and Sustainability at the University of Michigan. And today I'm going to present some work that we've been doing on measuring small-scale agriculture using remote sensing data. So why do we care about using remote sensing data for mapping small field agriculture? I don't think I need to really talk about this point too much since everyone is pretty much on the same page about this in this group, but data on field level farm characteristics can help enhance food production. It can both help identify regions that are performing suboptimally. So for example, they might be low yielding and they could represent regions that we should target with interventions. And we can also use satellite data to conduct impact evaluation at large spatiotemporal scales at low cost. I'm not going to present work today that shows how this can be done because I'm focusing more on the remote sensing aspects, but we do have a paper out in Nature Sustainability from last year if you guys want to take a look at how we've done this. So historically, it's been challenging to map smallholder field characteristics given the small size of fields compared to readily available imagery. So historically, up until about 2010, as David showed in that nice graph that Marshall made, we primarily were relying on Landsat satellite data as the finest readily available spatial resolution data product. And this is at 30-meter resolution. And you can see when we show what a smallholder system looks like, you really can't make out individual fields whatsoever. However, with some of these new data sets that are coming into play, including Planet, which is at 3.7-meter resolution, and Sentinel-2 data at 10-meter resolution, we can all of a sudden start to see not only field level, but maybe even subfield level characteristics. So we can derive many different data products at or near the field scale for smallholder farms using satellite data. And here's a list of different products that my group has been working on and also what's been shown in the literature. I'm not going to go into all of these different data products, but I would be more than happy to talk about them during the breakout group if it's helpful. So there's yield, cropped area, sowing date, crop type, estimates of burning, irrigation, tillage practices, and field boundaries. So despite this really exciting time where we do have this finer spatial resolution and higher temporal resolution satellite data available, there are some key challenges I think that do remain. The first is, and I think this is the biggest one, being able to get high quality and easily accessible training and validation data at scale so that we can actually create the remote sensing products that we're interested in. And also just thinking of ways that we might be able to fuse and use these different types of data products at different spatial, temporal, and spectral resolution. And the reason that I think this is particularly important for smallholder systems is that these systems are incredibly complex in terms of their heterogeneity. You'll have tiny field sizes where neighboring farms are doing something, completely different, and being able to, for example, get higher temporal resolution data or better spectral resolution data might allow us to pick up these differences across farms. And the other issue I should mention is that a lot of areas with smallholder systems are located in the tropics where there's intense periods of cloud cover or haze. So being able to get this higher temporal imagery is also really important for data coverage. So now I'm going to go through each of these 2 points and just highlight some different work that has tried to push the boundaries on this. So training data vary in their ease of collection. So I'm going to focus on an example from yield mapping from some of our work to discuss different sorts of training data that can be collected and how that influences remote sensing accuracies. So if we're trying to map yields, there have been several different data sources that have been used to train and validate these models. So the sort of best case or gold standard for estimating yields, as David has already suggested in his talk, are crop cut data, where you actually go into the field, you harvest the grain and you weigh the grain in field. But these data are very time and labor intensive to collect. Next, you could get self-report data where you do surveys with farmers, and this is easier to collect, but you still have to go into the field. And then the last is using model simulations as a way to generate data that you could use to train your remote sensing models. So for those of you who aren't familiar with crop cuts, this is just a picture of a crop cut that we did in northeastern India for wheat. So you go out at the time of harvest with the farmer, remove either subplots or the whole harvest, remove the grains, and then weigh the grains in field. And these are incredibly difficult and costly to obtain. Self-report data are much easier to collect, but there have been a lot of studies that have shown that self-report data can be inaccurate. So this might not be the best data that we want to use for training our models. And then finally, you could use models like crop models to actually simulate field data. And this is a paper that basically showed this approach from David's lab in 2015. So we did a paper in, let's see, here we go. 2016 in remote sensing environment, where we actually use these 3 different types of training data to train remote sensing algorithms, where we were mapping wheat yields at the field scale. And these are our resulting accuracies. So on each of these plots on the x-axis, you have predicted yield from our remote sensing model. And on the y-axis, you have the observed yield from crop cuts that we're treating as the gold standard or the correct yield measure. And what you could find is what you see is that when we use crop cuts to train our algorithms, we end up getting the highest accuracies and lowest RMSEs. Those go down when you use social survey data to train your model. And crop model data can also do an okay job, especially that you're not having to go into the field to collect data, but they're really not doing as well as this crop cut data. So what we've really been interested in trying to understand is, given the importance of collecting crop cut data, is there maybe a way that we can more efficiently collect this ground data at scale to train our remote sensing algorithms? So one idea that we've had, and this work is currently in progress, but we were thinking if we could use satellite data a priori, so before going into the field at the end of harvest, to actually target where we do the crop cut field data collection efforts, to see whether we can stratify these data collection efforts in a way to reduce the amount of data that we actually have to collect. So this work is in collaboration with Jordan Chamberlain and Balwinder Singh, who are part of Summit. And what we did was we actually ran an experiment in Bihar in northeastern India, where, as I mentioned, we used this high resolution satellite data prior to the harvest, so around March, one month prior to harvest. And what we did was we basically stratified where we wanted to do crop cuts in some fields that might seem lower yielding because they're less green, other areas that might seem higher yielding because they're greener. And we actually targeted crop cuts in this way. And what we found, these are just some preliminary results, but what we found was in black, these are representing all of our data points from all of the crop cuts that we collected across the landscape using Summit's typical approach of collecting crop cuts. And in blue are the points that we collected through our stratified sampling design. On the x-axis, once again, are our estimated yields from satellite, and on Y are our observed yield estimates. And then the R values for the targeted approach are here in blue, and for the regular full crop cut model are here in black. And what we found was that with the targeted approach, we can actually collect only 25% of the crop cuts from the typical approach that Summit uses, and we're getting very similar accuracies, both in terms of R squared and RMSE. So this seems like one approach where, you know, we still have to go on the ground to collect this crop cut data, but it might be a way to collect it a bit more efficiently. Another thing that we've been looking at, and I know others on this call have been looking at this as well, is thinking of ways that we might be able to improve self-report accuracies. So as I showed in that previous paper, self-reports weren't doing a really great job in terms of calibrating our remote sensing algorithms. So what we did, this is just one example of some of the experiments that we're trying to run in field. But what we did was we did a survey with 150 farmers, and we split these farmers into two groups. And in one survey, we just typically collected farm management information the way that we normally do through a social survey. And this is an example where we're trying to map sowing date. And for the second group, what we did was we actually spent about 5 or 10 minutes going into the details of the remote sensing analysis that we hope to do, how we think that these remote sensing data could actually benefit the farmer. And we actually explained by showing farmers the actual images we were going to be using and the algorithms we were going to use. We showed how the data they give us could improve the accuracies of our models. And unfortunately, when we actually tested to see whether by providing this extra information, did that lead to more accurate estimates of self-report sow dates, we found that unfortunately there was no difference. And we're not sure exactly if this is because our sample size was too small or it's because this intervention just wasn't effective. But this is just a line of research that we're hoping to build on over the coming years. And then finally, another way that we might be able to collect more ground data at scale is to use crowdsourcing to collect large volumes of information. And once again, this is a way to get a lot of data at fairly low cost. So I just wanted to highlight two efforts, not done by our lab, but just in the broader remote sensing community. So this is a paper that David already presented on, where they use crowdsourced GPS smartphone data from Plantix to actually map crop types in India. And then there's some other really great work coming out from Lyndon Estes and collaborators at Clark University, where they're actually using an iterative approach where they're having people look at high-res imagery, actually state what land covers exist, use that to train a model, and then they'll actually go back in and have these coders basically relabel areas that were found to be inaccurate. And they've been getting pretty good results mapping cropped area using this approach. So another challenge that exists is thinking about how we might be able to use all of these different types of satellite data products that are becoming available at different spatial, temporal, and spectral resolutions. So I just wanted to highlight two bodies of work that have been looking at this. So this is some work that is being led by postdocs in my lab, Preeti Rao and Nishant Bhattarai, where we're trying to map crop type at the field scale, once again in northeastern India. And here we run into the problem both of small field sizes, but then also that a lot of these crops have pretty similar phenologies. So we might need to rely on additional information like different spectral bands to pick out differences among these crops. So what we did in this paper is we're trying to understand how much can our accuracies improve if instead of just using one sensor, we're able to actually combine information from multiple sensors. And here we use 3 different machine learning algorithms to try to map crop type. And what we found is that if we use planet data, so this is a really high spatial resolution, pretty good temporal resolution data product, we're getting decent accuracies of about 0.8. If we add in Sentinel-2, we're getting a small increase in accuracy. And the reason we think that we might be getting this increase is Sentinel-2 does have some additional spectral bands, specifically in the red edge, which can be important for mapping vegetation. And then finally, when we add in Sentinel-1, we're actually getting a pretty big jump in accuracies of about 0.5. And we think the reason that this is happening is because Sentinel-1, this is radar data where you can actually collect data, good quality data, even if there are cloud cover and haze within the landscape. And in this area, we do have problems with cloud cover and haze a lot, even during the winter season where we're trying to map these crops. So we think this could be one approach to getting better accuracies at the field scale. And another approach that's being done more broadly by the remote sensing community that is really exciting is actually developing ways to fuse these data products from disparate spatial and temporal resolutions. So this is work that's being led by Josh Gray at NC State. And Kunwar, I know you probably have worked on this since you did your postdoc with Josh. But he's developing methods where you can actually input information, all of the images that are clear and of good quality from Planet, Landsat, and MODIS, and actually create fused data products at the resolution of Planet and at the temporal resolution at any point when you have any sensor satellite data. And we've been finding that these fused data products provide us the high spatial and high temporal resolution data needed to map things like sowing date and phenologies in these really heterogeneous small scale systems. So I'm not sure where I am with time, but just I wanted to go over the main take-home messages. So I think this is a really exciting time to be using satellite data to map field level characteristics of smallholder farms. We have a lot of new data products available at the spatial resolutions that allow us to map field level characteristics. I think the biggest challenge that remains is finding ways to get accurate and scalable training and validation data. And I think there are also new exciting possibilities for thinking of ways that we can fuse these disparate data sources to get even better resolution data. And this doesn't go along with the rest of my talk, but I just wanted to highlight this really quickly following on Jennifer's really interesting presentation. So I think one thing we all really need to think about from impact evaluation remote sensing community is thinking about this non-classical measurement error that does creep up in satellite data and can cause potential problems when we're trying to do impact evaluation. So I have a paper that came out in REAP earlier this year, and this is targeted more towards the data creators, so to the remote sensing community, on how we can think about how this error might be causing some downstream impacts. Thanks.
Marvelous. Thanks so much, Meha. That was fantastic. And I think we're going to return to some of this theme of measurement error and sort of big picture challenges with Kathy's talk at the very end. For now, let's turn to Binayak Mohanty, who's going to talk about soil moisture across scales. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me see if I can share my screen here. Can you see my screen now? Excuse me.
Looks good.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the invitation first. And I'm an outsider, and this is the first time I'm attending such a conference. I'm more of a physical process guy from hydrology community. So thanks for this opportunity. So I'm learning a lot of things today. All right, so today I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the activities what we have been engaged for last 25 years in remote sensing of soil moisture and soil hydrology in various fusion schemes and modeling schemes. So the basic topic I'm going to talk here a little more about the soil moisture, the significance, why it is important, what are the governing controls, how to scale them up, how to scale them down, how to use them for more parameter estimations, and eventually drought monitoring. Also, I'll touch a little bit about the retrieval algorithm that we used recently in the satellite remote sensing for soil moisture, and eventually the decision support systems that what we're talking here in this particular conference. So I think by now, I think most of you are familiar, of course, but I just want to give a little more 101 of the soil moisture and what we meant by that. And when the precipitation happens, so we, of course, it hits the ground and some water runs off, and that essentially goes out to the streams and other, but whatever is remaining, that goes back to the atmosphere through trees and grasses and all the plants, or evaporation through the soils. And whatever is going down below, that is your groundwater systems. So in a overall picture, we have to account for all these things, and eventually whatever is left over, typically people think it is soil moisture. But soil moisture is one of the most significant factor of what we are talking here today, from the aspect of agriculture and all those other things that we are talking, climate change, weather forecasting, etc. So soil moisture is pretty significant to be monitored in a careful manner in the top few centimeters, as well as in the root zone all the way to the groundwater systems. So what we have been working on over these years is to look at the processes that occur and that contain your soil moisture at a pore scale level, where it holds by capillarity, and eventually going to the larger footprints or the field scale, where we are growing crops and all those ecosystems, eventually to a more of a hydrology context, it is the watershed, and more atmospheric context, maybe we can talk regional scale, and eventually continental and global scale. So the differences are, these occurs are different processes, also has implications, how to recognize all this information and how to assimilate this information together. From the measurement perspective, that was more from the process perspective, this is more on the measurement perspective. We are measuring all the things at different uniform resolutions, like space-borne sensors. Over these last 20 years, we have Aqua, SMAP, or SMOS, Sentinel, and all those kind of things. NASA also, we do a lot of field campaigns. That includes like airborne sensors, mimicking those satellite sensors, PSR, ESTAR. We also have some tower and truck-based sensors that goes during the field campaigns to monitor those things at ground level and at a high resolution, and eventually at the level of, at the point scale, centimeter scale, where you can handle sensors that can monitor your soil moisture, or gravimetric sensors that you can take some samples and do that. So you can see in the right-hand side picture that these are synchronous sampling to collect this multi-scale data from satellite to airborne to ground information. So these are the typical satellite information on soil moisture over the years, like AMSR, E to SMAP. This is a typical picture of soil moisture wall to wall globally on a 2 to 3 days intervals. So essentially that gives you this information on a regular for past 5 years, and hopefully it is going to continue for another several years. Mostly it is measuring the top 5 centimeters of soil moisture using the microwave band here. So essentially it gives you the moisture at the top 5 centimeters, but if you want to extrapolate below that, you need to do modeling that will propagate the information to the down below. These are some of the sensors that gives you the data at high resolution from the airborne sensing, just like you were saying here, airborne sensor from the PSR. So this spatiotemporal data is really unique and very valuable as we collect it over last 5 to 10 years, because it gives a lot of memory and more climatology of these systems. Just to give a little perspective what we do in these cases, these are L-band sensors. It can be active or it can be passive. It would be affected by vegetation, surface roughness, soil. All these properties contribute to the soil moisture reflection. So this is a retrieval algorithm where we take this brightness, temperature, and deconvolute like different rays emissions from the soil, from the plants, or the double bouncing effect from the soil and the plants. So all together gives you the effective microwave radiative transport that translates eventually to the soil moisture in the ground. So essentially this is the raw product, and we get retrieval of soil moisture. So what we are using this for, then once we get this information of the soil moisture, brightness, temperature, we can use it at different scales. So if we look at a very pore scale level, we can look at the representative elementary volume, and we can understand how the soil is drying up or wetting up, what are the wilting points, what is the field capacity, porosity, etc. Or if you look at a bigger picture story, that what you're talking here in some of this bigger context, that means essentially we're looking at how these properties or the phenomena behave at multiple scale or larger scale, where you're talking irrigation or these landscapes or ecosystems. So one of the advantages of having this satellite data for a long term, you can really quantify some of these processes and their parameters from this dynamic information in a long-term basis. So that will really be eternal to be used for various different modeling, machine learning, or any other tools and techniques we are developing currently in that context. So these are some of the locations where we try to collect all our data sets. So if you look at this, quite a few in, of course, this is a little dated here, but you can see North America, Europe. There are some locations in Asia and China, Australia. There are a couple of locations in Chile, and very few sparse data in the other parts of the globe. And we have taken all these data sets coming from the airborne sensors, ground sensors, and satellite sensors in a very collective way and done different types of analysis to understand the underlying phenomena, the processes, and the drying curve, etc. So these are some of the approaches, but more importantly, we're talking about taking different land use, land covers, starting from agricultural to pasture to desert, forest, all kind of land use, land cover in different types of climate. And with that, I just want to jump into some of the case studies that what we have done over these years, in the past 20 years, using the soil moisture measurements at the ground level with the handheld sensors to airborne sensors to satellite sensors. So let's take some example here. So this is Arizona in a desert environment. So this is the soil moisture collection during the field campaign. So basically trying to collect at a footprint scale of your remote sensing footprint and different variations of topographic features, soil features, vegetation features. So we take this information, elevation, clay, sand, and leaf area index, and try to come up with more strategic and stratigraphic approaches to collect the data to evaluate our remote sensing retrievals. Here is another case in Oklahoma, which is mostly prairie land or some occasions shrubland, and then Iowa, where we are, where we these are encompassing soybean and corn fields. But so we wanted to take a look at all these different kind of conditions from the perspective of climate, as well as land use, land cover, as well as soil types and topographic features, because we wanted to understand the basic processes. That way we can extrapolate or interpolate without much hassle, or not like machine learning, but more process-based. So this is some of the findings that we look at, some of the contrasting and comparing the data coming from, let's say, Oklahoma to Iowa. We see clearly the Oklahoma area, which is a rolling topography. Topography is kind of dominant in the dry condition compared to the soil information. So basically, we are calculating the entropy based on the topography as well as the entropy for the soils. And the soil moisture correspond more to the topography here than the soils. On the contrary, here in Iowa, at early season of the crop growing season, we see this is more soil dominated. But I don't have the picture here, but some of these papers are mentioned here, that if you take a longer term picture across the season, you will see the signature of the soil, the vegetation dominance on soil moisture is going to increase, because as the plant grow, your soil moisture status changes because of the plant water uptake and other things, other activities happening there. So here is a bigger, broader picture here comparing those three locations, Arizona, Iowa, and Oklahoma. And here you can see that the signature or the dominance of these different factors, here is like sand, clay, elevation, and this is your leaf area index. You can see on the left-hand side, this is higher, means essentially your soil and elevation is, soil is more dominant. As you go further up in the scale, that means this is fine scale, this is coarse scale, 12 kilometer. As you go from the fine scale, your soil dominance reduces. On the contrary, your vegetation dominance increases, or as well as your topographic dominance also increases. In Iowa conditions, the same signature, we see the soil dominance at the local scale is higher, and as you go further up, the vegetation dominance is increasing and the topographic dominance is increasing. So here it's a little different, but it's still kind of in a similar signature. So mostly what we are finding, the soil is very critical at the local scale features. As you go further up in the ecotones, your topographic features, your vegetation and climate are more and more significant, controlling the soil moisture dynamics. So if I summarize all these findings here, so this is essentially how it looks like. And then we come up with a more of a general pattern over all these locations across the continent, that when we talk about field scale activities and soil moisture measurement, your soil texture is most dominant. As you go further up, your topography kicks in, and as you go further up, it is vegetation, and then finally your climate. So they're all acting together in tandem, but their dominance is shifting from one to the other based on what is the scale we are talking here. So that is so based on all these process findings, we have developed some nomographs, essentially using those processes and phenomena and wavelet analysis, try to take this influence of soil or topography or vegetation and come up with some toolboxes that we can fill in the gaps and get those information at a much higher resolution. So this is kind of the downscaling of this satellite remote sensing and getting to the point where we can find better available data sets at high resolution. So using this, we have done some of these things at the coarser resolution, but then eventually, as we are talking here, is that we need this information at farmer's level. A farmer is going to ask somebody that, how can I use the soil moisture data? And when the footprints are so big in kilometers, how can I use those information at my field scale? So in those cases, using those processes and scaling approaches we have developed, we take this vegetation cover information from other satellites or other ground data sets and use them to come up with more of discrete moisture content and evapotranspiration using different mixing algorithms that helps us to prescribe the farmers or users on the ground the values of the moisture content at much smaller scale, which is very useful for decision support systems. So essentially this is important, but this is not, I can just say this is mostly based on process understanding, so it can be transported or transferable to other locations with similar soil or similar vegetation. So this is an example from Oklahoma where we are taking the combination of the soil, shear, and vegetation together. So this is soil and vegetation in this field, and we have taken the subpixel and samples, and we have used our technique taking from the remote sensing data, gone to the downscaled it to the local scale, which is much more of at the point scale or maybe few meter scale. And these information show that these are measured at these points, and these are the data sets coming from the downscale product from the remote sensing. And using the techniques, we are pretty close to what we observe on the ground and what we predict based on our downscaling scheme based on this process understanding. Okay, so with that also, we try to have more information about drought prediction and flood prediction in those kind of agricultural landscapes. So if we take the physics here, so typically when there is a rainfall, first portion is like a dry down happens as the water goes and gravity drained, and then followed by a more stable stage 1 ET. And subsequently there is a transitional ET where the water is limiting, and then finally a vapor flow, which is happening at a much finer and dry end. So can we generalize the whole world and describe the climatology based on the soil moisture status and dynamics? That way we can bring this information back to somebody who can say, okay, I'm located here, I'm in this region. Can you give me the scenario of how the soil is going to dry out after a rainfall? So this is what we have done here. So because it's a combination of climate, soil, and plants, we have taken this approach at a global scale, and this is what we found. So these papers are just going to come out in WRR. So essentially, these are the seasonal information and a global wall-to-wall information based on this soil moisture drying patterns in those different locations. So you can see that the different portions, particularly like Africa or in those regions, so you can see there is a distinction between this fall season or during this winter season or summer season. There are different behavior, how these things behave in their slope and the wilting point and field capacity. So in other words, these informations are very useful for future application, for suggesting the farmers or users or water managers how to manage in those locations using this last 5 years worth of data coming from the satellites. So this is a picture of the usage of the data. You can see this is the drought map we reconstruct from this map data that we collected for past 5 years. And you can see these are the information that comes from sustained drought in US Western region. And here is the drought recovery in Indian Peninsula in 2017. And here is another drought recovery in West Africa or South Africa in 2015. And this is from Brazil, and this is from Australia. So most occasion we could mimic what actually happened on the ground in the past in a hindcast mode using the soil moisture data and using some of the approaches that we have developed to predict the drought based on the soil moisture status and the drawing down patterns in their acceleration. One of the features here I want to point out here, we are not just looking at the dry down patterns, but we are also looking at the acceleration of those drawing patterns. In some occasion, it could be slow, long drawn drought. In some occasion, it could be a very fast drought scenario, which is happening within 15 days and maybe something kicking back in. So those scenarios we can depict from these kind of approaches in this work. And finally, we are working on, as we're talking fusion, so a lot of data sets as we are understanding the processes because of the hydrology using various rainfall patterns, vegetation dynamics, your elevation as well as soil. We are combining all the process understanding and hydrologic models with the data sets coming from different resolution from satellite, airborne, and ground networks, and eventually also using the Bayesian hierarchical models. We try to fuse them, multi-scale data fusion schemes, and eventually import them in a very, what should I say, transitional way. It is not just a steady state condition. We are also taking a temporal, spatio-temporal algorithms. That way we can predict the soil moisture at different resolutions from coarse to fine, and also adapting to the dynamics of the vegetation, dynamics of the climate, dynamics of this other activities are happening in a particular condition. So overall, this fusion scheme is really giving you a non-stationary behavior of soil moisture, which is going to be very useful and robust for various different applications in the future at very different resolutions. So this is one of the applications finally we are trying to do, which is relevant here. We are talking about relationship discovery and learning with this different complex data, different resolution, eventually trying to find out county-wide soybean yield using some of this kind of data, using convolutional neural network and supervised learning. And this other example here is basically looking at this fusion of this core swath of soil moisture data sets coming from SMAP and SMOS, which is another satellite coming from ESA, and some of these other information together and fusing them and filling in the gaps, we are kind of getting a good coverage of the soil moisture at high spatio-temporal resolutions. So with that, I would stop here, and I would just conclude that the opportunities are plenty, that we can use this remote sensing data to understand the dynamics, processes, and their scaling algorithms. And that can be used for various different applications in agriculture, in hydrology, in climate, and other parameterization activities. So I was not familiar with this group, so I'm just giving a little broad view here, but hopefully that is useful for the community out here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that was excellent. Thank you so much. So we are going to again transition into breakout rooms to follow up on these two presentations. So once again, I posted the link here. We'll have one room focused on soil moisture where we can return to Binayak's presentation and ask perhaps some specific questions about the kinds of things that these projects are trying to achieve. A breakout session on small scale agriculture, and again, a general discussion breakout session. So please click on the link here in the chat that you would like to follow. Note that at the end of this breakout session, there is not a scheduled 10-minute break. So we will be reconvening back here at noon Pacific time for one final wrap up talk. So thanks so much.
and we just got into data issues in our general discussion topic. So yeah, it's been a good week for us. Thanks. I'm looking forward to hearing your talk. People I've heard about your thinking on this, and Jen's stuff keeps coming up in multiple different meetings. So we definitely got the right people in this room.
This is great. Kudos to you guys for putting this together. It's really nice to actually have the communities talking to each other. More of this.
As difficult as that is.
No, exactly. And there's still places where it's like, I need to think about that a lot harder, but.
Great. Well, at the risk of missing a breakout room worth of people, I suspect we should go ahead and get started. So I'll do a quick introduction to Kathy Baylis, who is going to talk about impact evaluation opportunities and challenges for using remote sensing data. We will have 10 minutes of Q&A at the end of this. Kathy has 20 minutes for her talk. So if you do have questions, please do stick them in the Q&A as we go, and we'll also solicit hands at the end. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Kelsey. Thanks for having me, everybody. Just a second, let me tell I'm using PowerPoint because I'm old. All right, there we go. So again, I'm honored, both honored and kind of embarrassed to be asked to be here today. Honored because again, this is a great crowd in a very needed conversation in terms of getting the impact evaluation people together with people on the remote sensing community, and this is a lot of fun. Embarrassed because I just moved to a geography department from an agricultural economics department, so I think I could give a far better talk on this in about a year, but you're going to get the baseline version today. So what I'm going to try to do, and Chris will recognize this slide from a kind discussant yesterday, actually, is sort of try and do a quick discussion of kind of remote sensing and impact evaluation. And I'm going to skip the peak of inflated expectations because I think a lot of us have been through that, and maybe just touch on the trough of disillusionment a bit. But again, I'm hoping that we're actually sort of moving up the slope of enlightenment today. And so mostly I'm going to focus in on some cautionary tales, but then some places where I think there's some really exciting things coming down the pipe, along with just the data in general and some of the opportunities it affords us. So I want to start by stepping back, because this was asked to me yesterday by my husband when I told him about this talk. He says, well, wait, so you're talking about remote sensing data, like why are they different than any other data? And basically everybody else has talked about all of these very, very cool places where remote sensing allows us insight into things we haven't been able to see before, either degree of spatial extent, spatial granularity, some cases temporal extent and temporal granularity. So all of those very, very cool things. We also have to think a little bit about, and these are all things that people have mentioned, by the way, that this question of what actually are we measuring? So what are we observing when I hit download to that and sort of download a bunch of data that have been interpreted from remotely sensed information, and then talk a little bit about what spatial and temporal scale, in both in terms of sort of degree of observation here, but also what we actually want to use. So the punchline there is we may not always want to use the most fine-grained data for our impact evaluation. That may be different from what we want to use for ground truth data. And then there's this issue of, so we're observing landscapes, right? Or we're observing fields or forests. If we care about the mechanism behind sort of why was that patch of forest cut, we want to know sort of who's making that decision and how. And the problem is that's not always completely obvious, and we want to kind of think a little bit about that. I also want to note that just as David mentioned and Jen mentioned and Meha mentioned and sort of everyone's noted, our non-remotely sensed data sources have some variant of all of these issues as well. But I'm going to focus in on places where we might want to think about it in the remote sensing context. I'm going to touch on this only briefly because I want to come back to it at the end, but a lot of people have talked about this issue of what exactly are we measuring. You know, when we, as a sort of naive remote sense data user, which I am, sort of pull down a bunch of data on kind of land cover. Again, I'm using an interpreted product, right? And that interpretation comes with error, and we know that there's issues in places where that error is non-classical. That can become even more important, sort of the more indirect the noise, the sort of signal is to what we're trying to measure. So, you know, if we're looking at some of the cool work that David's done and his team on sort of predicting poverty, right? There's going to be issues of errors there, and we know that they're probably not going to be classical, and we want to take them into account in our analysis. Come back to that a little bit later. Scale. I want to talk a little bit about scale, and mostly I want to touch on this because I think this is maybe not intuitive to, at least to sort of the applied economists in the rooms. This part is intuitive. We get data, we now can sort of, using raster data, right? We can sort of aggregate it to all sorts of different levels. We can, especially with these really fine-grained sort of planet data or, you know, planet combined with sentinel data, we can get sometimes information at a plot level. We can aggregate up to a 1K by 1K grid cell. We can get this into a county. And so it's this question of, okay, so what's the right unit of analysis? And again, that's not obvious. And if you look at sort of the work done in applied economics, impact evaluation, people are using all sorts of different units of analysis here. By the way, this is not unique to remotely sensed data. There's a long history in particularly kind of economic geography of people talking about, and Jen mentioned this earlier, the modifiable areal unit problem. And that's this case where we've basically, you can aggregate data at different levels, and either aggregated at a census block group or up to a county, et cetera, and you can get different, basically see different patterns in the data at different scales. An obvious level, or an obvious way, you can imagine that you're hardly ever going to see kind of negative spatial correlation at a more aggregate scale, because that just gets blurred out. However, if you've got really positive spatial correlation, so like sitting with like, a bit of aggregation is still going to allow you to see that spatial process, right? So we've thought about the MAUP usually in the term of aggregation or in the term of zoning. And Jen brought up the sort of a good example of gerrymandering. That's kind of an issue of zoning where we have different aggregations, but at the same spatial scale can give us different results. We now also have this issue where we observe things at a really, really fine-grained scale, and in some cases at a scale that's sort of below the decision-making process. So imagine, for example, we've got kind of data from Planet that gives us sort of data at a, 2 meter squared resolution, but the decisions are being made at some kind of plot level, which is much bigger, right? And so we have this choice of using kind of this really, really granular data, which again, we might well want to use for ground truthing. But we might want to not use it for our unit as our unit of analysis. And let me try and explain why. So this is from an earlier paper that Jen very kindly referenced. So it's a Goldilocks in the raster grid. We were feeling creative when we made up the name. What we basically do is we do sort of just a Monte Carlo study, although we also apply it to some data we have in Mexico, where we kind of look at what happens if you have sort of a true data generating process at one level, and then you basically take observations at a smaller level with a little bit of error, okay? And then we sort of run through different levels of the true data generating process and different levels of observation. So that's like assuming that we're using different sizes of raster grid as our unit of analysis and kind of see what happens, okay? We do a bunch of different sort of scenarios. And I'm going to show these really, truly ugly figures. My apologies, but I think they'll get the point across. What we have here is those two horizontal dashed lines are the true coefficients on sort of two different variables. One we're calling treatment, one we're calling a characteristic, but you can just think of that as, again, we got two variables there. And then we're going to run through having the true data generating process be at different levels compared to the level of observation. So the line shows the coefficient estimate at all the different levels of observation given a specific true data generating process. And the punchline here is that smaller is not always better. Right? And the intuition, and so here, if you see that big drop down in the green line, that's the estimate of that coefficient on X as we increase sort of the level of observation. So when we take a really low level of observation, given a slightly higher level of true data generating process, we're way underestimating our X. So just to run through that, so those here, I'm kind of just changing our true data generating process, but you can always see that we're underestimating our value of the coefficient on X if we're using that smaller unit of analysis, that's smaller than the truth. This is basically just an errors and variables problem. And in some ways, when you realize that's like, oh yeah, of course. Where it gets ugly is, what if these two variables are correlated with each other? Because then you don't just necessarily have attenuation bias, right? Then you can actually end up overestimating the other coefficient. So I'm going to run through the same kind of process where we're increasing the true level of true data generating process. And so things get wonky. That blue line is, again, our estimate of treatment. This is this thing correlated with kind of this characteristics. And what's happening is, because we're underestimating the coefficient on X, we end up overestimating it on our treatment. Kind of unnerving, right? And so basically the take-home message here is that going too small is not always what we want to do. We don't necessarily want to use the most granular level of data for our analysis. And just to give you a little intuition of what's going on here, imagine again, you've got this sort of 2 meter by 2 meter information in a plot, and maybe you're looking at something like, say, soil moisture, and you're trying to use that to determine what crop somebody planted in that field. Well, they're probably not taking, unless they're using precision agriculture, but they're probably not taking that kind of micro level soil moisture information into account. And so you're basically measuring, you're putting error into your model. And I'm not talking about remote sensing error. I'm assuming we observe everything perfectly here. But even just by using that wrong sort of unit of observation, we're adding an error into our model, which can wreak some havoc. Well, eek, okay, so what do we do? Well, I mean, the take-home message here for me was, it's worthwhile really thinking, what do we think is the right unit, the decision-making unit? And if we're looking at plots, then we want to have something that's kind of close to a plot. If we think that it's a community making a decision on a community forest, then we might want something at a spatial scale that's capturing that. We also want to just generally, explore the spatial correlation in your variables, try to take them into account. And if you can, try a couple different spatial scales, et cetera. But long story short, this is something I think to think about. And I know I'm always tempted. It's like, if we've got more granularity, let's use it. It's like, maybe let's at least think about it. Then there's this question of, okay, so how do we link remote sensing data with the people who are making the decisions on that parcel of land, for example? Now, this is great if we've got plot level data and we know the household and we can link those household characteristics to those plots. That's not always the case. And we also have to worry about issues of spillover, again, less likely maybe if you've got a farm plot, but very relevant if you're dealing with community forests, for example. And then I'm going to, again, jump back to sort of talking about this linkage effort, because that's sometimes non-trivial. Just a quick example, this is from some earlier work, and again, in Mexico, these are communities where we have community managed forests, and the reddish dots are forest loss over time. And we first do just kind of a sort of difference in difference plus matching estimate on what was a payment for ecosystem services. Don't worry about the specific example. It's more, I just want to show you how these treatment estimates change. Okay. Notice that there's pretty clearly some spillover here. And this isn't just a mechanistic spillover in terms of, you know, fuzzy pixel units, boundary issues. It really looks like we have communities, people from one community going over to other communities and deforesting. And anecdotally, that's what folks were telling us was going on. And so we've got the spillover. We'd like to take that into account. We see that there is a high degree of spatial correlation, not a shocker, right? In terms of deforestation, we use a spatial matching technique. The idea is here we're taking into account what's not only happening within that unit of observation, but in nearby units for matching. Again, I'm not trying to sell this as a method. I just only want to make the point that if we take that kind of spatial correlation into account, we suddenly get a very different treatment effect. Then we take into account the fact that sort of our treatment and control areas here, and we aren't using a grid here. Basically, we're using sort of parcel level data, rightly or wrongly. It's an old paper. we then say like, all right, but we might have some issues in terms of boundary measures and knowing what's actually happening on those boundaries. And that might be creating some problems technically, right? It might be a SUTVA violation. We might be having some of those parcels are actually affected by our treatment. So we went and we just stripped them out. Okay, and so this is sort of like what Patrick was talking about earlier, where we're trying to ensure some degree of physical separation between our treatment and control areas. That's the estimate there. Again, just a cautionary tale, I guess, more than anything. I don't necessarily want you to believe that these are the right estimates, but the point is that those kind of spatial correlation matters, and taking it into account really matters. We also have this issue in terms of we have basically fuzziness, if you like, in terms of our units of observation that may be creating, sort of manufacturing a form of spatial correlation, and it's going to tend to be positive. So for example, like in those middle areas between those two plots, we might have pixels that sort of overlap them. Well, if they're taking some average between the two, that's going to give us positive spatial correlation regardless of what's happening in terms of behavior. On the other hand, we know that land use in one unit is also going to affect land use in the other unit. And so there are going to be these sort of behavioral responses, whether it's because we've put in a road and so it's easier to deforest nearby, or my neighbor planted this interesting crop or adopted this new technology, I'm going to do that too. So anyway, there's going to be these behavioral spillovers that we might really be interested in understanding. There's also going to be economic spillovers potentially, right? Where what we as a community do here, we stop logging, that might increase logging elsewhere through price response. Disentangling these things is, I think, really interesting and important and tricky. And one trick is that we want to try and take into account this sort of mechanistic spillover, this thing that's happening because of our sort of imprecise remote sensing observations, and strip that out to try and understand some of these more behavioral spillovers. And so I don't know, to me, this is kind of, it's something we're thinking about if you're interested in spillovers and interested in sort of understanding the mechanisms behind land use decisions. I think this kind of stuff is important. Last, and I'll try and keep this quick. I mean, the other thing is that, of course, we don't usually use remotely sensed data in isolation. Usually we're trying to put it with, and again, I'm not talking about ground truth data here, although it's data we could possibly use for ground truthing. I'm talking about sort of other socioeconomic information or information around some intervention, et cetera, that we're trying to link in to our remotely sensed data. All of us who have done this know that we're embedding a whole bunch of assumptions when we sort of link, usually, right, these socioeconomic characteristics or data to our remotely sensed information. We're having to make decisions over kind of what is the appropriate spatial linkage, what's the appropriate temporal linkage. I mean, an obvious example is we probably want to consider weather and other effects during sort of a growing season, as well as maybe contemporaneously to understand current prices, for example. We might want to understand if we're trying to link prices to land use change, we want to kind of know what market should we be looking at to try and get those prices to be able to link with what's happening on this parcel. Ideally, we'd like to know that potential price at the farm level, but we usually don't observe that. So we need to think through this stuff. It's also tricky because, again, the scales that these data come at are often very different. So, you know, just careful thought. And so I guess one of the take-home messages I want to leave you with really is that we want to think through the data generating process. And by that, I'm not talking about the machine learned model used to interpret the remote sensing. I'm talking about the behavioral model that's sort of underpinning these data processes and sort of take them into account when we're trying to build up those linkages. On the flip side,
if you want to have a little bit of time for Q&A, you want to kind of wrap up?
Yeah, this is my last slide. Thanks, Karen. I do want to touch on, so to me, where I think there's a lot of really cool opportunities is a combination of remotely sensed data with survey-based or other information. So, for example, I mean, there's a lot of places we can use remote sensing to kind of bolster information that we don't have. So we could look at, you know, sometimes you can use this to look at, say, you know, whether you see parallel trends between different communities, one that was treated, one that doesn't, if you don't have that kind of information directly. More interesting, I think, and Meha's talked about this, in using, again, the remote sensing data to maybe target data collection. She was talking about it in terms of getting ground truth data. I want to push that even further and say, to me, where we really want to push things is understanding where we have problems in our machine learning models that are using the remotely sensed data to predict an outcome, right? Because if most machine learning models, or a lot of machine learning models, basically are meant to be updated over time, right? And the idea is to try and figure out where is it getting it wrong, get more data, get it better. And to me, this is sort of a neat place where we could actually try and improve that linkage and improve some of those remote sense data. Punchline, careful thought, underlying behavioral model and spatial processes that underlie these data, I think, help. But lots of opportunities. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Excellent, thanks, Kathy. And maybe you can leave this slide up. I think we'll do the same. So we'll open the floor. So raise your hand if you want to ask any questions. Maybe Kathy, in the meantime, I'll read from the Q&A. There's a question from Daniel Millimet saying, so you can also try throwing out the treatment group. I guess this is on one of the particular studies that you presented, and define a new treatment group. The controls would be far away from the true treated. Okay, sorry, this is a little bit difficult to come back to, I think, unless you
yeah, so I assume, I assume, Dan, that you're thinking about, oops, I'm not seeing the question, but yeah, I mean, sure, I mean, one could definitely try and sort of ensure, again, that you have enough spatial distance between treatment and control. Sometimes that might mean that you're getting worse controls. And so then it's sort of, there's kind of a, sometimes a little bit of a trade-off. I mean, if kind of the best counterfactuals are places that are nearby. But yeah, it's the other way is to try and understand, again, the spatial process that's underlying your data, and strip that out. One trick is what happens when you've got treatment that's actually affecting that spatial process, and there things get a little more complex again.
This question by Rashid.
Hi, thanks. So if I was just to make sure I'm getting the message right, in a way, when you say going small is not always useful, you don't want to have as many observations as you can. if I understand well, there is still a very useful stage of getting very disaggregated, very refined unit pixels, so that you can, especially if we're working in small scale agriculture, because we want to avoid sort of these mixed cells that are in between different plots, and you want to sort of define your set of cells that are exactly inside of the plot. But then, so it doesn't mean we shouldn't even work with this, but if I understand well, we work with this, we make sure we create some aggregated units that are much more precisely defined because we have a higher resolution. But then at the end, we should work with what was the unit of decision rather than just the unit that's made available by the pixel. Is that, so we don't fully reject the small degree of analysis, right?
No, thank you. That's perfect. Exactly. It's yes. Ideally, once those data as sort of as a beginning stage is a question of kind of what level you aggregate them to. So ideally, is granular a pixel as one can get is great. You don't want to necessarily use those as your end as your unit of analysis for your end regression.
Thanks.
And then there was, this is the question I was looking for, it just had disappeared. So there was a question by Rachel Neugarter that already had some answers from Patrick and Jen, but it's also a question for you. So she's asking, is the MAUP really an issue for deforestation data that is typically coarser to begin with?
So MAUP, of course, I mean, most of the work on MAUP is worried about aggregating up. So for that, in that case, MAUP is very much an issue in that we might worry that we're working at too coarse a spatial resolution to pick up stuff, and then there's lots of kind of evidence that will miss spatial patterns at that level, and as well as the practicalities that we might miss kind of small scale logging and stuff like that. Get to the regression to the mean. If you just on average, right? If you think of you're averaging over a largish pixel, you're going to reduce the variation you see in your data from the true variation on the ground. In terms of what I was thinking of, probably not. It was sort of it just depends on kind of what sort of the right decision making unit. And fair enough, quite often it's going to be below 30 by 30.
Okay, and then any other questions to raise?
I have a question here. So I think I come from a physical science background. So the physical science essentially means some of the processes that occur at molecular scale or pore scale is still valid at larger scale maybe, but there may be some underlying new processes that keep up, and that adds up the complexity. So when we take a equation or process understanding at a local scale, it may not be wrong at the larger scale, but it is just kind of added by new processes at the bigger scale. So it's not that true then in that case, rather than discarding this local scale process understanding, rather make it more multi-physics, multi-scale, multi-behavioral thing to really address the concern and question that what we have in hand.
Thanks, Binayak. Yeah, I think what I totally glossed over is the fact that often underlying a bunch of these both outcomes as well as sort of inputs, we have multiple scales, we have processes at multiple scales, and so then it comes a question of sort of how to deal with that. And yeah, you're right. So I don't want to leave you with it. This is the only way to do it. Just mostly, I want to highlight that as a cautionary tale, that it's worth thinking about, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Okay, Kathy, there are some further questions on spatial standard errors, etc. But since you committed earlier to share some references with everybody, I think we can take those that way. So with that, let's finish this particular session. Thanks so much, Kathy, for those thoughts that will keep us thinking. And let me pass the word to Kelsey for wrap up on the emLab side.
Great, thanks. And my job is to get us one step away from a close. I'll pass it back to Karen to say the final word. So my main point is to just really thank all of the participants, all of the panelists, all of the audience members for really fantastic questions. I think the large number of participants, and the very active discussion really highlights that this is an area of very active interest for many of us. So I think some of us are still at the very early stage of Kathy's diagram, and maybe are going to come crashing down. Others of us are emerging from the trough and starting to, feel a little bit of hope. And I think that one of the goals of this workshop is to help push us past some of that volatility toward what I think you called the plateau of productivity, so that we can actually start to collaborate and get some things done. And so, at the very least, I think our hope is that this convening has allowed everyone to make some new connections, to maybe learn a thing or two, and I think it's very much a starting point. I certainly learned a lot. I know that the projects that are part of this SPIA-funded call for proposals learned a lot. I think we could have gone on for many days to learn as much as possible, but hopefully this is a taste that encourages future follow-up work. I think one of the things that to me is most surprising about this is really thinking about pushing some of the learning that has happened, for example, in the agriculture and agricultural productivity space, into thinking about measurement of potential environmental spillovers that go beyond just deforestation. And I think we heard some really neat examples of that today, and also heard some places where a lot more innovation is likely to come. So with that, again, just a huge thank you, especially to the panelists, many of whom were sort of pulled into this without necessarily knowing a lot of what they were getting into. And so hopefully it was a productive experience for everyone. And with that, let me pass it on to Karen. And thanks also, many thanks to SPIA for supporting this work and for encouraging some of this communication across different disciplines.
Thanks, Kelsey. And so before kind of having some final thoughts on this, let me first continue with the thanks and thank emLab for pulling this amazing workshop together. And it very much feels like the beginning of a conversation, but even just to start that conversation is heroic. And so thanks to you, but also to Erin, who's done a lot of the background work here, and to the whole emLab team, including Robert, who's been helping to facilitate. Just kind of a couple of final thoughts from the SPIA side, and for those of you who know the CGR only from afar, it's possibly useful to know that the CGR is going through a big reform process, and part of and the interest in the type of topics that we've talked about, I predict will only increase over time, and hence SPIA's interest to look in them will increase even further increase over time. Partly, so SPIA's kind of, I think one of my takeaways of today is that one of the reasons we started very much thinking about remote sensing more deeply was kind of based on a lot of questions of looking more at landscape level outcomes, and ultimately, kind of, I think one of the takeaways of today for me is that this is not a landscape or micro level question. It's really kind of the marrying of both that is important here. I guess the other takeaway for me is that the different communities we had together today, in a certain way, speak very different languages, different disciplines, different languages, and that always makes it difficult to start a conversation. That maybe we're at a phase where, partly because the economists know a little bit more or are a little bit more familiar with machine learning than we were maybe 5 years ago, and partly because we realize that a lot of what we do has its limits, possibly also more than 5 or 10 years ago. This is probably the right moment to start those conversations. And then I think really kind of looking forward to kind of further thinking and development on the measurement error challenges that have been highlighted, and also thinking about, certainly I know when I'll be reading proposals that I'll be looking for that, and thinking about which ones are systematic versus not, and if they're systematic, are they going to be, how does that matter for what we're trying to do in terms of looking at impact, and when does that matter, and when does it not? And I guess the final point, which is maybe more of a challenge, is that ultimately, I guess one of the remaining challenges is that, of course, remote sensing can only measure certain types of outcomes and not others. And so there is maybe a little bit of, of a risk of the agenda being too driven by what we can measure rather than what we want to measure. And so kind of putting that out there as something to be collectively aware of. So with that, let me thank everybody for this very active participation, just reiterating and also acknowledging that it is for some participants late on Friday night, and for all the other participants the evening before Halloween, and so very much appreciate that even so everybody's was here. Thank you. And so to be continued.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. This was great.